It was a strike that defied logic, a mission that seemed impossible on paper, and yet it became one of the boldest acts of the Second World War. In April 1942, just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when America was still reeling and the Axis seemed unstoppable, a daring plan was set in motion, launching heavy bombers not from land bases, but from the deck of an aircraft carrier deep in the Pacific Ocean. The Doolittle Raid, as it would come to be known, was not about destroying factories or crippling Japan's war machine, but about something far greater, sending a message that America was not broken, not defeated, and would strike back even when the odds looked impossible. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, stripped down and modified, were carefully loaded onto the USS Hornet, their crews aware that they might never return home. The men who volunteered knew the dangers: low fuel, no safe return route, and the likelihood of capture or death if they fell into enemy hands. Yet they went forward with courage, lifting off into stormy skies and aiming for the heart of Tokyo itself. This was not just a bombing raid, it was psychological warfare, a spark of defiance that lifted American morale and shook Japanese confidence. Tonight we will retrace every moment of that mission: the secrecy, the training, the launch, the flight over Japan, and the aftermath for both the crews and the world. It is a story of bravery, ingenuity, and sacrifice, told against the backdrop of a world at war. And before we begin this incredible journey, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? Drop your location and the hour in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels across the globe as we unfold the entire history of the Doolittle Raid, America's bold strike that changed the course of World War II. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the tranquility of Pearl Harbor was shattered by the roar of Japanese aircraft descending from the clouds. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave struck, unleashing torpedoes and bombs upon the anchored American fleet. The battleship Arizona erupted in a cataclysmic explosion, a fireball tearing through steel and sending 1,177 men to their deaths in seconds. The Oklahoma capsized within minutes, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its overturned hull. Flames engulfed the California, the West Virginia, and the Nevada, while oil slicks on the harbor's surface ignited into sheets of fire. In the skies above, dogfights broke out as a handful of American pilots scrambled into the air, vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Civilians across Oahu watched in horror, smoke rising in dark plumes visible for miles out to sea. By the time the second wave concluded, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. More than 2,400 Americans were dead, and the illusion of safety had vanished. The United States had been hurled into war. The scale of destruction was staggering, not only in lives lost, but in strategic consequences. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, along with cruisers, destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft obliterated on the ground. Airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows were left burning wrecks, their hangars reduced to twisted metal. The U.S. Navy, the guardian of the Pacific, appeared crippled, its most powerful assets silenced in a single morning. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, responsible for the defenses of Hawaii, were left stunned, accused of unpreparedness in the face of catastrophe. For ordinary Americans, the news spread with electric speed, transmitted by radio bulletins that interrupted Sunday routines across the nation. Families huddled around receivers, listening in disbelief as broadcasters described flames consuming warships in Pearl Harbor. Isolationism, once a powerful current in American politics, evaporated overnight. The war that many had hoped to avoid had arrived uninvited, its cost already written in blood, and the question now was how America would respond. Strategically, the blow was nothing less than a crisis of survival. With its Pacific fleet battered, America's ability to project power across the vast ocean was severely compromised. Battleships, the pride of naval tradition, had been the backbone of U.S. strategy, and now most of them lay on the seabed or smoldering in shallow water. Aircraft carriers by chance at sea during the attack became the Navy's last great assets. The Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga would now carry the weight of America's counteroffensive on their decks. The U.S. Navy's command structure was forced into emergency improvisation, shifting doctrine overnight from battleship dominance to carrier warfare. Supplies of aircraft, bombs, and trained pilots were scarce, leaving the fleet vulnerable in the critical first months of war. Across the Pacific, Japan's forces advanced with alarming speed, seizing Guam, Wake Island, and threatening the Philippines. The Pacific balance of power had tilted dangerously in Tokyo's favor, and America faced the greatest naval challenge in its history. In Washington, the political shock was immediate and profound. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had warned of Japanese aggression for years, now stood before Congress on December 8th to declare December 7th a date which will live in infamy. His speech, broadcast live across the nation, galvanized the American people, who demanded swift retribution. Congress responded with a near-unanimous vote for war against Japan, signaling the end of neutrality and hesitation. Yet even as the nation roared with resolve, military leaders faced the daunting reality of their predicament. American forces in the Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, were already under heavy attack. Guam had fallen within days, and Wake Island would soon follow, its defenders overwhelmed after a heroic stand. Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to the Pacific Islands, its navy striking with a confidence born of years of preparation. The United States had declared war, but it was still unprepared for the scale of conflict it now faced. For the American people, the emotional shock was as devastating as the military losses. The homeland had long believed in its distance from foreign threats, protected by oceans that stretched thousands of miles. Pearl Harbor shattered that belief in a single morning. Families grieved sons lost at sea, while others enlisted by the tens of thousands, determined to avenge the attack. Posters calling for war bonds, enlistment, and sacrifice appeared on city streets within days. Across factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, workers began the shift to wartime production, retooling for planes, tanks, and weapons. Civilians participated in blackout drills, dug air raid shelters, and prepared for attacks that never came but were now feared possible. Hollywood shifted its lens to war propaganda, reinforcing the message of national unity and purpose. The spirit of America hardened from complacency into determination, and the demand for an immediate response grew louder with every passing day. Military planners wrestled with how to strike back at Japan, despite the nation's weakened fleet. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, pushed for bold actions that would restore American confidence. General Henry Hap Arnold of the Army Air Forces considered the possibility of bombing the Japanese homeland. Yet geography posed a formidable obstacle. Japan lay thousands of miles across the Pacific, far beyond the reach of existing bombers. Carriers could strike island targets, but they lacked aircraft with the range to reach Tokyo and return safely. Submarines prowled the seas but lacked the power to deliver a decisive blow. America's allies, Britain and China, urged patience, knowing time was needed to rebuild strength. But Roosevelt understood the psychological stakes were just as important as the strategic ones. The American people needed proof that Japan was not untouchable, and so a daring idea began to take shape. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, whispers circulated through the corridors of the Pentagon about an audacious plan. Could land-based bombers be modified to launch from the deck of an aircraft carrier? Could they reach Japan, strike its cities, and then escape by flying on to China? The proposal sounded implausible, even reckless, but desperate times demanded imagination. Engineers studied aircraft designs, weighing the feasibility of adapting the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. Naval officers debated whether carriers could accommodate such planes without crippling their own defenses. Pilots questioned whether they could master takeoffs from a short deck under combat conditions. Yet the concept carried an undeniable allure, a chance to bring the war directly to Japan's heart and restore American prestige. Roosevelt, ever the gambler in strategy, encouraged further exploration, and in those early days of 1942, the seeds of the Doolittle Raid were planted. The devastation of Pearl Harbor had opened a wound, but within it lay the spark of resolve. America, stunned and grieving, refused to accept defeat as destiny. The shock of December 7th galvanized the nation into unity, transforming fear into a demand for action. Strategists, politicians, and soldiers alike understood that a symbolic blow against Japan was essential, not only for morale, but for the future of the war. The United States stood at the crossroads of despair and determination, and it chose determination. As winter deepened and Japan pressed its offensive across the Pacific, American leaders worked feverishly to craft their reply. That reply would take shape in the form of one of the boldest missions of the entire war. The Doolittle Raid was still only a dream, but it was a dream born in the ashes of Pearl Harbor. December 1941 left the Roosevelt administration reeling, but Roosevelt's first instinct was to convert shock into action. Within days, the president pressed his chiefs of staff for options that would do more than merely retaliate. He wanted a blow that would restore American confidence. For Roosevelt, the calculus was both strategic and psychological. A raid on Japanese territory would puncture the invulnerability Tokyo assumed and reassure allies that the United States remained potent. Public opinion demanded a response, and newspapers and radio commentators clamored for something dramatic to lift the nation's spirits. In the White House Situation Room, maps and intelligence briefs collected under words like options and feasible, as aides argued over timelines and risks. The president listened, steering conversations toward missions that could be executed with existing forces and in time to have political effect. He understood that a purely symbolic attack might be derided if it lacked substance, yet also realized that a large-scale invasion across the Pacific was impossible in the short term. The search for a middle path favored innovation, methods of striking back that exploited surprise rather than mass. Roosevelt's directive thus became the seed for audacious thinking: find a way to hit the Japanese homeland and return proof of American resolve. That mandate would shape every subsequent debate in the Navy, Army Air Forces, and the halls of power that spring and summer of 1942. Within the Pentagon and Navy Department, the debate took on the cadence of inter-service rivalry as Admiral Ernest King and General Hap Arnold assessed what the nation could do. King, a blunt and combative naval professional, favored operations that leveraged carrier task forces and naval striking power close to Japan's periphery. Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces and a pioneering aviator, argued that only strikes on the Japanese home islands would have the desired psychological effect. The two men agreed that striking Tokyo itself would cause shock, but they diverged on means. King skeptical that his carriers could launch aircraft with the necessary range, Arnold pushing for creative use of Army bombers. Both were painfully aware of constraints. The US had few carriers in the Pacific immediately available, and shore-based heavy bombers lacked the range to reach the home islands from safe bases. Technical officers ran calculations in pencil and chalk, gauging fuel consumption, takeoff distances, bomb loads, and the effects of weather on over-ocean navigation. Arnold proposed experimenting with medium bombers stripped of weight to extend range, while King probed whether a carrier might risk approaching closer to Japan than doctrine advised. Behind their debates lay the human cost. Commanders imagined crews flying beyond known safe corridors, the odds of capture and the diplomatic implications for air crews landing in China. Roosevelt listened to both men, pressing them to find a plan that balanced audacity with a realistic chance of survival for the men involved. Their negotiations and grudging cooperation would form the technical and organizational backbone of what became the Doolittle Raid. Politically, any raid on the Japanese homeland would reverberate far beyond the Pacific, signaling to Britain, China, and a wary American electorate that the United States would not be passive. Churchill had urged aggressive measures to keep Tokyo off balance, and his cables pressed Roosevelt to demonstrate that Allied power could strike at the enemy's core. Chiang Kai-shek's China mattered too. Bases there might offer refuge for crews, and a visible American strike would validate the sacrifices Chinese civilians were already making against Japanese occupation. Domestically, Congress and the press watched for evidence that the administration could translate grief into decisive action without recklessness. Roosevelt understood that a carefully executed strike could stiffen Allied resolve, encourage occupied peoples, and undercut Japanese morale and propaganda of invulnerability. Conversely, a bungled attempt risked amplifying Japanese brutality in occupied China and could provide Tokyo with propaganda victories it sorely needed. The president therefore framed the mission not merely as vengeance, but as a necessity of coalition politics and global perception. He insisted that operations must be coordinated with Chinese authorities for recovery and humanitarian relief after aircrews landed or bailed out. The diplomatic pieces, reassuring allies, protecting civilians in China, and sustaining domestic support, had to fit the military plan like interlocking gears. In the end, the political stakes gave the raid a priority it might not otherwise have received, converting innovative ideas into ordered action. Technically, the problem was daunting. No existing bomber carried both the range to reach Japan and the ability to take off from a carrier deck. Engineers and test pilots evaluated candidates, focusing on the North American B-25 Mitchell for its favorable lift-to-weight characteristics and rugged reliability. The B-25 could carry a substantial bomb load for a medium bomber, yet it required extensive modification to maximize fuel and minimize weight for the proposed mission profile. Naval aviators and Army engineers collaborated to design auxiliary fuel tanks, remove non-essential equipment, and devise techniques for extremely short-field takeoffs. The carrier deck presented unique challenges. The aircraft needed to accelerate from a moving platform in heavy seas and climb rapidly while laden with ordnance. Bomb sites and defensive armament were altered or removed to save weight, and radio and navigation equipment were standardized to aid crews flying over vast oceanic distances. Captain Mark Mitcher and other carrier commanders ran simulated deck launches, measuring wind-over-deck requirements and the precise speed needed to lift a heavily laden bomber. The decision to fly medium bombers off carriers was unprecedented, a collision of naval risk and aerial innovation that demanded flawless coordination. With technical solutions progressing, the administration still needed a leader who combined aeronautical genius with combat temperament to command the mission. Into that gap stepped Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a pilot and engineer whose audacity and experience made him the natural choice to bring an impossible plan to life. Doolittle's appointment was as much symbolic as practical. He was a noted test pilot, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a man comfortable improvising under pressure. Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs wanted a commander who could train volunteer crews quickly, maintain absolute secrecy, and make split-second decisions in hostile airspace. Doolittle accepted the mission with a mixture of humility and steely resolve, insisting on rigorous preparation and clear rules of engagement for his men. Volunteers came forward in droves, young officers and NCOs eager to do something decisive after Pearl Harbor's humiliation. Selection prioritized pilots with carrier landing experience, gunnery instructors, and men whose audacity matched the mission's risk, while mechanics and navigators were chosen for endurance under stress. Training at Eglin Field in Florida focused on short takeoff techniques, formation flying at low altitude, and precise navigation over open ocean by dead reckoning. Crews practiced with stripped-down B-25s on narrow runways to simulate carrier decks, recording exact distances for throttle settings and flap positions. Secrecy was paramount, personnel were sworn to silence, and training was conducted under cover stories to prevent leaks that might reach Tokyo's ears. Navy officers collaborated closely with Doolittle's teams, integrating deck handling procedures and emergency protocols for carrier launch and recovery at sea. The result was a compact, fiercely dedicated unit of aviators and support men who believed they could do the impossible and were prepared to pay the price. With crews trained and aircraft modified, the Navy assembled a carefully guarded task force centered on the carrier USS Hornet, chosen as the bomber launch platform. Escorting the Hornet were cruisers and destroyers, and the fast carrier USS Enterprise provided distant air cover, forming a protective ring for the unprecedented operation. Admiral William Bull Halsey and other fleet commanders coordinated clandestine movements, ensuring the task force slipped out of harbor under cover of darkness and secrecy. Sailors painted over, identifying hull numbers, and radios went quiet as the ship steamed westward toward a rendezvous point in the mid-Pacific. The challenge was immense. Carriers had never sheltered 16 medium bombers on deck, and still retained the ability to defend themselves from enemy attack. Support vessels carried additional fuel, spare parts, and the tools necessary to service Mitchells at sea, while intelligence ships monitored Japanese fleet movements for any sign of discovery. The Hornet hummed with nervous energy as crews and airmen final-checked engines, radio beacons, and in-flight navigation charts under the watchful eyes of naval officers. The Pacific crossing demanded absolute discipline, no shore leave, strict light control at night, and constant drills to prepare for immediate launch. The closer the force approached Japan, the greater the sense of foreboding and exhilaration among sailors who felt history unfolding under their keels. In that floating triangle of steel, men who had never met learned to operate as one unit, bound by shared secrecy and the enormity of the mission ahead. As the task force steamed toward its launch point, Roosevelt and his inner circle monitored progress with a mixture of hope and strategic impatience. Intelligence reports flowed in of Japanese patrols and picket boats, heightening the risk that secrecy could be compromised at any hour. The president remained adamant. He preferred a smaller, bold strike sooner than a larger, postponed operation that might never materialize. This urgency informed every operational decision, from the composition of the task force to the rigorous training timetable imposed on crews. Naval planners understood that once within striking distance, the margin for error would shrink dramatically, and that success depended on timing as much as skill. Roosevelt's political instincts favored spectacle, but he deferred to military judgment on execution, ordering them to strike only when commanders believed chances of reaching friendly territory remained viable. Still, the knowledge that the nation awaited action added pressure to every officer on the radio nets and in the carrier briefing rooms. Men spoke quietly of the consequences if captured, not only personal fate, but also the potential diplomatic crisis if the raid failed and provoked harsher enemy reprisals. Yet amid the tension, A current of fierce determination ran through the force, each sailor and aviator convinced that the mission could restore America's standing after Pearl Harbor. That conviction, forged in the White House and hardened at sea, propelled the enterprise forward into the dangerous months ahead. The presidency's demand for action had pushed military innovation to its limits, forcing sailors and airmen to imagine new methods of projection across an ocean empire. What began as a political imperative became a laboratory of creative engineering, inter-service collaboration, and daring leadership. The costs of failure were clear: Liv's diplomatic fallout, and potentially harsher Japanese measures in China, but so too were the rewards: restored morale and a demonstrated American reach. Roosevelt's insistence steeled planners and commanders to accept risks that peacetime prudence would never allow. The coming months would test not only machines and tactics, but the psychological fabric of a nation craving reassurance. Within the bowels of the task force and the hangars of the Hornet, B-25 sat ready, their skins cold under tarpaulins and their crews waiting in tense silence. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence and lookouts began to stir, making each hour a race against discovery. Yet the combination of presidential will, naval power, and aerial ingenuity had produced a plan that was audacious in conception and meticulous in preparation. The stage was set for a mission that would resonate far beyond its military effect, shaping perceptions of American resolve for years to come. Ahead lay the voyage across the Pacific, the tension of detection, and a dawn on April 18th that would mark one of the boldest strikes in modern warfare. James Harold Doolittle was born in 1896 in Alameda, California, but his earliest years were spent on the rough edges of Alaska. As a boy in Nome, he learned resilience in a frontier town where survival meant courage, improvisation, and grit. Small in stature, but fearless in spirit, Doolittle was quick to fight, quicker to climb, and fascinated by machines of every kind. By the time his family returned to California, aviation was entering its infancy, and young Doolittle was mesmerized by the idea of flight. He studied mechanical engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and his life's trajectory became bound to the world of aeronautics. When America entered the First World War, Doolittle joined the Signal Corps and earned his wings as a military aviator. Though the war ended before he could fight in France, he immersed himself in training, tactics, and technology. The cockpit became his classroom, and the skies his laboratory. In those early years, he began to craft the reputation that would define him: a daring pilot with an engineer's mind and a gambler's courage. It was a reputation that would one day make him the natural choice for the impossible. In the 1920s, Doolittle became one of America's most celebrated aviation pioneers. He gained fame for his bold stunt flying, racing aircraft at breakneck speeds, and pushing machines beyond their supposed limits. But unlike barnstormers, Doolittle paired daring with science, enrolling at MIT to earn a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He was one of the few pilots who could design, test, and fly aircraft at the very edge of possibility. In 1922, he completed the first cross-country flight in under 24 hours, proving long-range aviation's potential for both war and commerce. He became the first pilot to perform an outside loop, a dangerous maneuver that tested the limits of both aircraft and human endurance. In 1929, he pioneered instrument flying, proving that pilots could take off, fly, and land, relying solely on instruments, even in total darkness or cloud. Each accomplishment advanced aviation as both science and profession, inspiring military doctrine and civilian aviation alike. He was decorated with trophies, medals, and accolades, but his true reward was mastery of the air. By the 1930s, Jimmy Doolittle was a living legend, known not only for daring feats, but for revolutionizing flight itself. Doolittle's military service was equally transformative. He remained an Army Air Corps officer, even while pushing the limits of civilian aviation, blending worlds few men could bridge. He served as a test pilot, flying prototypes that pushed speed, altitude, and maneuverability, often at lethal risk. In an era when aviation was still fragile, his skill saved designs, improved safety, and refined tactics for future combat operations. Commanders valued his judgment as much as his audacity, trusting his ability to both lead men and master machines. He taught new generations of pilots not just how to fly, but how to think about flying. His dual identity as warrior and scientist positioned him uniquely in a military that still struggled to treat aviation as central to war. By the eve of World War II, he had amassed a career few could equal: combat readiness, academic brilliance, and practical leadership. His reputation was not just national, but global, respected by aviators in Europe, Asia, and beyond. This rare blend of genius and grit would soon place him at the center of America's most audacious gamble. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Doolittle was 45 years old, older than most combat pilots, but still at the peak of his skills. He was serving as a lieutenant colonel, consulting on aviation tactics, and known across the Army Air Forces as the man who could solve problems others deemed impossible. General Hap Arnold, looking for someone to lead a mission that defied conventional doctrine, immediately thought of Doolittle. Arnold knew he needed someone with technical precision, operational creativity, and the nerve to gamble lives under impossible odds. Doolittle had spent 2 decades proving he possessed all three. He was fearless in the cockpit, meticulous in planning, and possessed the charisma to inspire men under crushing pressure. His record of innovation, from instrument flying to long-range operations, directly addressed the problems the raid would face. Moreover, his reputation gave the mission weight. If Doolittle said it could be done, men believed it. Arnold's choice was both practical and symbolic. In Doolittle, America found not just a pilot, but a commander whose name embodied audacity. Doolittle embraced the mission with characteristic confidence, though he understood its dangers better than anyone. He knew bombers had never launched from a carrier, and he knew most crews might not return. Privately, he confided to colleagues that he expected to be court-martialed if the mission failed. Yet his resolve never wavered, and he approached planning with a scientist's rigor and a gambler's calm. He oversaw modifications to the B-25C, insisting every ounce of weight be justified and every gallon of fuel maximized. He immersed himself in training routines, personally demonstrating short takeoffs to prove they could be done. With his aviators, he balanced discipline with camaraderie, forging bonds of loyalty that would sustain them in the air, and for many, in captivity. To the Navy, he offered deference and professionalism, bridging the traditional rivalry between services. To the public, he offered nothing. Secrecy was absolute, and no hint of the raid could be allowed to slip. Only later would America realize that its boldest strike had been entrusted to its boldest pilot. Part of Doolittle's genius lay in his ability to inspire confidence in others. He had a natural authority, the kind born not of rank but of reputation, reinforced by countless flights where he had risked his life and prevailed. Men volunteered to fly under him, not because they expected safety, but because they trusted his judgment in the face of danger. His crews trained harder, endured longer, and believed more deeply because they followed Jimmy Doolittle. He led not from behind but alongside, flying the first aircraft himself to share in the risks of his men. When doubts crept into conversations, Doolittle countered with optimism, grounded in technical mastery. He could explain the mathematics of fuel burn as easily as he could describe the sensation of pulling out of a dive. This ability to unite science and spirit made him singular among commanders of the era. To his men he was neither distant general nor reckless stuntman. He was the leader who would ask nothing of them. He would not do himself. Yet for all his confidence, Doolittle carried the weight of the mission heavily. He understood the raid's symbolic purpose, and he knew the potential cost in American lives and Chinese civilians. His engineering mind could calculate odds, and those odds told him that many crews would not survive. Still, he accepted the burden, seeing it as his duty to transform Roosevelt's vision into reality. In private moments he admitted he might never return, and if he did, he expected to face reprimand rather than reward. But his sense of responsibility outweighed fear, and he committed himself fully to preparation. He embodied the idea that leadership is not about certainty of success, but about willingness to bear the consequences of failure. For Doolittle, the raid was not only a military mission, but a moral one, a strike for a wounded nation. His acceptance of that burden set the tone for everyone under his command. It was not bravado, but responsibility that made him the man for the mission. Jimmy Doolittle's selection was no accident of chance, but the convergence of a lifetime of preparation and a moment of national need. His childhood toughness, his scientific brilliance, his daring feats, and his military discipline all aligned for this single task. The raid required audacity beyond measure, and America possessed in Doolittle a man defined by audacity. It required technical expertise, and Doolittle had rewritten aviation with his inventions and records. It required leadership under fire, and Doolittle commanded not by fear but by shared courage. His name alone inspired confidence that the impossible might just be possible. As the carriers steamed west with 16 modified bombers on their decks, every man aboard knew who was leading them. The mission's fate rested on Jimmy Doolittle, a pilot, engineer, soldier, and gambler all in one. History had handed him the chance to repay Pearl Harbor with daring, not caution, and he was determined to seize it with both hands. The concept of launching land-based bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier was in 1942 nothing short of revolutionary. Naval doctrine had always treated carriers as the exclusive realm of lighter, more agile aircraft designed for short takeoffs and landings, not lumbering bombers built for runways thousands of feet long. When the idea was first raised in the tense weeks after Pearl Harbor, many senior officers dismissed it outright as fantasy or suicide. Army Air Forces strategists questioned whether their planes could even clear the deck without plunging into the sea, while naval commanders worried about risking a valuable carrier for what might prove an embarrassing failure. The challenge was as much cultural as technical. It required the Navy and the Army, two fiercely protective services, to trust each other with an experiment that could end in disaster. Yet desperation breeds innovation, and Roosevelt's demand for a direct strike on Japan forced leaders to reconsider the impossible. If bombers could be carried within striking range and launched at dawn, they could deliver explosives onto Tokyo itself, something no one had imagined in the opening months of the war. The symbolism of that act, American aircraft roaring over Japan's capital, was too powerful to ignore. For many in uniform, the mission represented the first chance to erase the shame of December 7th. Still, every calculation suggested the risk outweighed the likelihood of success. And so the debate began: could a bomber truly fly from the deck of a carrier? The search for a suitable aircraft quickly narrowed to the North American B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber with a rugged frame, twin engines, and respectable range. Other bombers were considered, from the Douglas B-23 to the Martin B-26 Marauder, but their size, fuel consumption, and handling characteristics made them impractical for carrier use. The B-25, with its relatively short wingspan of 67 feet and its proven ability to take off from shorter fields, offered a glimmer of feasibility. Even so, modifications would be essential. Bomb loads had to be reduced, defensive armament stripped, and every ounce of unnecessary weight discarded to extend range. Fuel tanks were added in bomb bays and crawl spaces, cramming the plane with gasoline that made it a flying torch. Navigational equipment was refined, and Norden bomb sites were replaced with makeshift substitutes to save space and secrecy. The prospect of launching 16 such aircraft, each weighing over 10 tons when fueled, from the narrow deck of the USS Hornet, was enough to make seasoned officers pale. Naval aviators, trained in the delicate ballet of carrier operations, doubted whether land-based Army pilots could master the technique. Army pilots, accustomed to the length of concrete runways, wondered if their bombers could even survive the attempt. The skepticism was palpable, but the idea refused to die, and in that refusal lay the beginning of something audacious. To move forward, the Army and Navy had to overcome deep-seated rivalries and learn to speak a common language. Admiral Ernest King, brusque and uncompromising, knew the Navy alone could not deliver the kind of dramatic raid Roosevelt demanded. General Hap Arnold, determined to prove the strategic value of air power, understood that the Army needed the Navy's carriers to reach Japan. Meetings between staffs were tense, with each side guarding pride while struggling to bridge gaps in doctrine and culture. Naval officers spoke of deck handling, arrestor cables, and wind over deck calculations, while Army officers countered with discussions of payload ratios, range charts, and bombing altitudes. Slowly, mutual respect replaced suspicion as both sides recognized the stakes. What emerged was a fragile but vital partnership, one that embodied the new reality of a global war where no single service could fight alone. Engineers and tacticians from both branches collaborated in secrecy, running calculations late into the night in smoke-filled rooms. The project demanded secrecy at every level, with only a handful of men aware of its true purpose. By the spring of 1942, the impossible idea had become a classified directive, and Jimmy Doolittle, already appointed commander, began transforming it into a reality. Testing became the crucible in which theory was either proven or abandoned. In February 1942, Army pilots and their B-25 CES were brought to Norfolk, Virginia, where the USS Hornet waited for experiments that could make or break the plan. Crews watched with tense faces as Mitchell bombers, their wings stretching the deck's width, were maneuvered into launch positions by Navy deck crews. Onlookers held their breath as the first bomber throttled up, engines screaming, wheels racing across the pitching wooden deck. With the ocean yawning ahead, the plane clawed into the air and slowly gained altitude, clearing the bow by a margin of mere yards. A cheer erupted from sailors and officers alike, though many admitted afterward that their hearts had nearly stopped. Further trials proved that with skill, timing, and favorable wind, the B-25 CES could indeed launch safely from a carrier deck. The experiments vindicated Doolittle's confidence and gave the Navy the reassurance it demanded. Yet these trials also revealed the fragility of the margin for error. Miscalculate by seconds, and an aircraft would plunge into the waves. Despite the risks, the tests succeeded, and the impossible became possible. The mission now moved from speculation to planning. Doolittle himself took an active role in refining the technique, demonstrating that leadership meant sharing risk with his men. He climbed into a Mitchell, strapped himself into the cockpit, and personally executed a short deck takeoff, showing that it could be done by skill and not by chance. His example electrified the crews, erasing doubts and replacing them with determination. Training shifted to Eglin Field in Florida, where long runways were marked with chalk lines to replicate the limited space of a carrier deck. Pilots practiced throttling engines to maximum in seconds, releasing brakes and lifting off within a span of just 467 feet, the length they would have on the Hornet. Navigators drilled in dead reckoning, learning to chart courses over endless ocean with little margin for error. Gunners rehearsed operating stripped-down defensive stations, knowing that in reality they would rely more on speed and stealth than firepower. The atmosphere was one of secrecy, with cover stories shielding the crews from curious questions about their unusual routines. Each flight brought more confidence, and each success brought them closer to readiness. By March, the crews no longer asked if the mission could be done. They asked only when. Still, doubts persisted at the highest levels, where admirals and generals weighed the consequences of failure. If the carriers were lost, America's remaining Pacific Fleet would be crippled at the very moment it was needed most. If the bombers were shot down before reaching their targets, the mission would be dismissed as a reckless gamble. If crews landed safely in China, Japanese reprisals could devastate villages and civilians who aided them. The risks were so great that some argued the plan should be abandoned, waiting instead for more secure opportunities later in the war. Yet Roosevelt's insistence and Doolittle's confidence outweighed hesitation. The mission was as much about symbolism as destruction, and its value lay in showing both America and Japan that the US could strike back. That symbolism justified risks that no peacetime officer would have accepted. For Roosevelt, the raid represented political necessity. For Doolittle, it was a test of aviation's limits. For the crews, it was a chance at revenge. By the time final orders were given, the doubts had not disappeared, but they were buried beneath determination. The Navy, accustomed to precise operations, now braced for chaos, unlike anything in its doctrine. Deck crews trained in the delicate ballet of carrier launches had to adjust to bombers that dwarfed fighters and dive bombers in size. Planes would not be launched in orderly cycles, but in a one-time sequence, each Mitchell roaring down the deck like a charging beast. Sailors practiced securing chocks, signaling with flags, and calculating wind direction with the precision of surgeons. Commanders prepared contingency plans for crashes on deck, fires, or aircraft plunging into the sea. Fuel and ordnance crews rehearsed at double speed, knowing that once the task force neared Japan, there would be no time for hesitation. Even the placement of each aircraft on the deck was studied like a puzzle, ensuring enough clearance for takeoff while preserving balance for the ship. The task force became a laboratory of innovation, as Navy and Army worked shoulder to shoulder in ways rarely seen before. What had begun as an improbable concept was now operational reality, and every man involved knew he was part of history. By April 1942, the impossible idea had become a secret mission steaming westward across the Pacific. 16 bombers sat lashed to the deck of the USS Hornet, their wings folded against the sky, their fuselages packed with fuel and bombs destined for Tokyo. Behind them, sailors and pilots moved with quiet precision, aware that discovery could doom them all. Above them, Admiral Halsey's task force maintained strict radio silence, prowling waters patrolled by Japanese picket boats. Within the holds of the bombers, maps were marked, bombs were armed, and pilots studied their orders with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The improbable had crossed into the realm of reality, carried forward by ingenuity, desperation, and courage. And as the Hornet plowed through rough Pacific seas, the world unknowingly stood on the edge of a moment that would shake both empires. What began as a spark in Roosevelt's mind had grown into a mission that would strike Tokyo itself. It was the impossible idea now transformed into steel, gasoline, and men. and soon it would rise from a carrier's deck to carve its place in history. The men who would become Doolittle's raiders were not drafted by chance, but handpicked through a careful process of skill, character, and courage. Volunteers from the 17th Bomb Group, already among the finest medium bomber units in the Army Air Forces, were asked to step forward for a mission described only as extremely dangerous. They were told little, no destination, no details, only that success was uncertain and survival was far from guaranteed. Despite the ominous warning, nearly every man raised his hand, eager to strike back at Japan and redeem the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. From these volunteers, 16 crews of 5 were selected, combining pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, and gunners. Each man underwent scrutiny, not only for technical ability, but for temperament under extreme stress. Doolittle wanted men who could improvise, endure hardship, and trust one another without hesitation. Pilots needed steady hands and calm nerves. Navigators required sharp eyes and a mind for dead reckoning. Engineers had to coax performance out of machines pushed to their limits. Gunners were expected to fight with stripped-down weapons, knowing speed and surprise were their real defense. Above all, each crew had to function as a single organism. They would soon train not for ordinary missions, but for a feat no one had attempted before. Their destination for training was Eglin Field, Florida, chosen for its isolation and sprawling facilities where secrecy could be maintained. Nestled amid pine forests and sandy stretches, the base became the laboratory where theory turned into practice. Runways were marked with chalk lines representing the 467 feet of deck space available on the USS Hornet, forcing pilots to master takeoffs under strict limitations. Instructors timed them with stopwatches, measuring acceleration, throttle control, and flap deployment with scientific precision. Navigators drilled over the Gulf of Mexico, flying long sorties where the horizon offered little more than endless water, teaching them to rely on charts, compasses, and dead reckoning. Bombardiers practiced with improvised sights, stripped of northern devices to save weight and deny technology to the enemy. Engineers learned to fuel auxiliary tanks, adjust carburetors, and keep engines running even when stretched beyond specifications. Gunners fired from hatches at towed targets, learning to defend themselves with minimal armament against hypothetical interceptors. Each day's training ended in debriefs where mistakes were dissected and solutions recorded. The secrecy surrounding them was so intense that even fellow servicemen on base had no idea what these men were preparing to do. They trained in shadows, knowing their mission would shine in daylight. Short-field takeoff training became the defining trial of their preparation, a challenge that tested every pilot's nerve. The sight of a heavy B-25, engines roaring at full throttle, lumbering down a runway barely half its usual length, left spectators doubtful each time. But slowly technique replaced fear. Engines spooled to maximum before brakes were released, flaps set to precise angles, and timing perfected so the bomber lifted at the very edge of disaster. Doolittle himself demonstrated the maneuver, taking off in full view of his men to show it could be done. His bomber clawed into the sky, wheels barely clearing the markers, a living proof of leadership by example. Crews drew confidence from his demonstration, repeating the drill until the unnatural became routine. They learned to handle crosswinds, sudden gusts, and misjudged throttle, correcting instinctively without panic. Ground crews adjusted tire pressure, checked struts, and monitored wear, ensuring machines could endure repeated abuse. Each successful takeoff built faith not only in the aircraft but in the men themselves. By the end of training, the roar of engines on short-field launches became the soundtrack of confidence. What had once seemed impossible was now muscle memory. Navigation posed challenges every bit as daunting as takeoff. The raid demanded flights over vast stretches of open ocean beyond radio beacons, in conditions where even a minor miscalculation could mean missing China and crashing into the sea. Navigators trained relentlessly, charting courses by compass headings, speed calculations, and sun or star fixes. They learned to plot drift caused by crosswinds, calculate fuel burn under varying conditions, and adjust course using nothing but instinct sharpened by math. Practice missions over the Gulf simulated the monotony and danger of flying hours over featureless blue. Bombers flew in loose formation, but each navigator was drilled to fly independently, knowing they might be separated during the actual raid. Errors in training were corrected mercilessly, for in combat they would mean death or capture. Doolittle insisted that navigators become masters not only of precision but of improvisation, able to find China's coastline even if storms or Japanese fighters scattered them. Their notebooks filled with calculations, their minds became compasses, prepared to guide their crews across an ocean of uncertainty. Navigation was not a skill in this mission. It was survival written on every chart and compass rose. Survival training went far beyond navigation, extending into the brutal realities of what awaited after the bombing runs. Crews were instructed on how to bail out at night, how to land safely by parachute in unknown terrain, and how to evade capture in hostile territory. Manuals provided rudimentary Mandarin phrases, though few men spoke them with any fluency. Medical officers taught improvised field medicine, from treating wounds with limited supplies to using local herbs for infection. Maps of China, often outdated and vague, were studied endlessly, though many still knew they would be guessing once they landed. Food survival kits included concentrated rations, chocolate and tablets to purify water, all packed into minimal weight envelopes. Weapons were scarce, limited to sidearms or a few rifles, more symbolic than practical against Japanese patrols. Chaplains counseled men on the moral burden of leaving behind comrades if capture seemed certain. The raiders prepared for every eventuality, though in truth no training could truly simulate the ordeal ahead. What sustained them was not the manuals or drills, but the knowledge that they were volunteers bound by choice to accept the unknown. Survival was both a skill and a mindset, and each man carried it like an invisible pack on his back. The bonds forged during training became as vital as the technical drills, living together in barracks, eating in the same mess halls, and flying endless sorties side by side created a brotherhood deeper than rank. Laughter-filled evenings, even as men joked darkly about what lay ahead, hiding fear beneath humor. They gave each other nicknames, swapped stories from home, and played cards to break the tension of secrecy. Instructors noted how quickly cliques dissolved, replaced by mutual trust across crews. Pilots relied on navigators as lifelines, engineers on gunners for protection, bombardiers on every other man to get them to the target alive. Even disputes turned into lessons in cooperation, resolved by the understanding that survival would demand total unity. Doolittle encouraged this bond, joining them for meals, listening to their worries, and ensuring they saw him as a fellow raider, not a distant commander. Training created not just crews but families, each aircraft carrying 5 men bound by loyalty stronger than steel. In war, machines could falter, bombs could miss, and engines could die, but brotherhood was unbreakable. And at Eglin, it was forged in sweat and secrecy. Secrecy itself hung like a shadow over the entire training program, shaping behavior and psychology alike. Families were told nothing of where their men were or what they prepared to do, only that they were safe on routine assignments. Rumors swirled among other units at Eglin, guessing at the unusual drills with bombers marked for short fields and strange cargo. The men learnt to answer with silence or misdirection, protecting the mission with their very words. Orders restricted letters home, censors combed through correspondence, and outsiders were barred from training grounds. Even within the base, compartmentalization ensured only Doolittle and a handful of officers knew the full scope of the plan. This secrecy bred an intensity unlike normal units, a sense of carrying a burden too important to be spoken. It hardened discipline and sharpened focus, as each man understood one careless word could doom the mission. The silence became part of their identity, as distinctive as their aircraft or their uniforms. They were shadows preparing to fly into the light, and in that silence their determination deepened. By March 1942, training had transformed volunteers into a specialized strike force, capable of executing a mission no one else dared attempt. Pilots who once doubted the possibility of carrier launches now accelerated down chalk-marked strips without hesitation. Navigators charted courses across oceans in their sleep. Engineers coaxed engines into squeezing every drop of power, and gunners handled stripped-down defenses with calm precision. The men joked about their odds, but beneath the humor was iron resolve. Each had accepted the risk of not returning, yet none wished to turn back. Doolittle, watching their progress, saw not just crews but history's instruments, sharpened and ready. Secrecy cloaked them, but within it they burned with pride, aware they were preparing for something unprecedented. Training ended not with a ceremony, but with quiet readiness, the men carrying maps, charts, and the weight of expectation into their final days at Eglin. Soon they would leave Florida behind, bound for the Pacific and a mission whispered only in code. They had trained for the impossible, and soon they would attempt it. The bold plan to strike Japan required more than daring aviators and modified bombers. It demanded a fleet strong enough to deliver them into enemy waters. At the center of this task force stood Admiral William Ball Halsey, a commander whose very nickname embodied aggression and resolve. Halsey had built a reputation in the Pacific as a leader who favored offense over caution, a man who believed that the best defense was to keep the enemy off balance. He was given command of the naval arm of the operation, responsible for shepherding Doolittle's bombers across the Pacific. The centerpiece of his force was the USS Hornet, a brand new aircraft carrier commissioned only months earlier. Normally she would have carried fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, but for this mission her deck was stripped bare of naval aircraft to make way for 16 bulky B-25 Mitchells. Sailors marveled at the sight of the Army bombers lashed to the wooden planks of the flight deck, their wings stretching over the edges, their noses pointing toward the sea. To protect this precious cargo, Halsey gathered a powerful escort of cruisers, destroyers, and the veteran carrier Enterprise, which would provide air cover along the way. The task force became a moving fortress, each ship bound to the others by secrecy and destiny. In April 1942, they slipped quietly out of San Francisco Bay, steaming westward under the Golden Gate Bridge. Few who watched from the shore realized they were seeing history in motion. The USS Hornet herself was a marvel of modern naval engineering, though her role in this mission tested her in ways no designer had envisioned. At 809 feet long, she was built to launch sleek naval fighters and agile dive bombers, not lumbering land-based aircraft. Her crew of over 2,000 sailors now found themselves caretakers of Army bombers that seemed almost alien on her deck. Special cranes had hoisted the B-25 Sav aboard in Alameda, California, lifting them carefully into place before they were lashed with steel cables and chocks. Below decks, hangars usually crowded with spare naval planes were instead filled with supplies, extra fuel, munitions, and equipment to sustain the bombers until launch. Sailors adjusted quickly, their pride evident in the role they played in preparing for the mission. Some scrawled chalk messages on the bombers' noses, short prayers, good luck charms, and even crude jokes meant to lighten the tension. The Hornet's captain, Mark Mitcher, worked closely with Doolittle, integrating Navy procedures with Army needs in a rare display of inter-service cooperation. Life aboard ship became a strange hybrid of Army and Navy culture, with airmen sharing meals with sailors and practicing takeoff signals on deck. Every man aboard knew he was part of something extraordinary, though only a handful understood exactly how extraordinary. The Hornet had been transformed from a carrier into a springboard of revenge. Halsey's task force was more than just the Hornet and her bombers. It was a carefully balanced armada, designed for survival deep in hostile waters. Alongside the carrier sailed heavy cruisers like the USS Northampton and Vincennes, bristling with 8-inch guns that could pound enemy surface ships. Light cruisers offered additional firepower and flexibility, while destroyers formed the protective screen, their sonar and depth charges ready to fend off Japanese submarines. The USS Enterprise, commanded by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey himself, provided the naval air wing that would shield the task force from enemy reconnaissance and attacks. Her fighters and dive bombers patrolled the skies, ensuring that if Japanese aircraft appeared, the lumbering bombers on the Hornet's deck would not be caught defenseless. Oilers and supply ships accompanied the combat vessels, a lifeline of fuel and provisions for a fleet steaming thousands of miles across open ocean. Every ship had its role, every crewman his duty, in a formation that moved like a single organism. To outside observers, it appeared to be a routine carrier strike force, but inside its decks lay one of the most daring gambits of the war. The men knew discovery meant disaster, for the Japanese Navy still ruled the Pacific with numbers and experience. Yet secrecy was their greatest ally, and silence was their shield. Together, they sailed into the unknown. The logistics of the mission were staggering, requiring coordination across two services unused to such close cooperation. Army bombers consumed far more fuel than carrier aircraft, and so auxiliary tanks had to be filled not only before takeoff, but also carefully rationed during the voyage. Mechanics worked tirelessly to keep the B-25Cs in top condition, adjusting engines, calibrating instruments, and ensuring every modification held firm in the salty Pacific air. Sailors assisted by securing the bombers with cables and chains, constantly checking that the rolling of the ship did not jolt them out of alignment. Ammunition crews loaded the bomb bays with high explosive and incendiary bombs, weapons chosen for maximum psychological as well as physical impact on Japanese cities. Supplies for the army men, rations, flight gear, maps, and even sidearms were distributed discreetly through Navy stores. Communication between ships was kept to a minimum, using flag signals and brief coded transmissions to preserve radio silence. The Hornet's deck became a workshop, where sailors and airmen rehearsed launch procedures under the watchful eyes of Doolittle and Mitcher. At night, the bombers loomed in the darkness like silent sentinels, their presence a constant reminder of the mission's stakes. The logistics were complex, but every detail mattered, for in this mission there was no room for error. The Pacific was vast, but the margin for success was razor-thin. Secrecy cloaked the operation from its very inception, with layers of deception protecting the mission from enemy spies and curious eyes alike. Officially, the Hornet's deployment was reported as a routine movement of naval forces, nothing out of the ordinary for a fleet repositioning in wartime. The Army aircrews told no one of their true destination, not even their families, writing vague letters home about training and special duties. On board, sailors were warned against speculation, though whispers spread quickly as the sight of 16 Army bombers made it clear that this was no ordinary cruise. Guards patrolled the decks at night, preventing unauthorized personnel from approaching the aircraft. Orders restricted photography, ensuring no images of the bombers lashed to the flight deck could slip into the press. Even within the fleet, knowledge of the ultimate target was confined to a tiny circle of commanders. Rumors ranged from raids against island bases to missions in Siberia, but the truth was held tightly, a secret carried westward across the Pacific. The Japanese, vigilant yet unaware, remained blind to the danger approaching their shores, and that blindness was the task force's greatest weapon. Admiral Halsey himself embodied the spirit of the mission, driving his men forward with determination and confidence. Known for his aggressive style, he understood the importance of morale in ventures as risky as this one. He moved among the ships, speaking to sailors and officers, assuring them that though the mission was dangerous, it was also vital to America's cause. His presence inspired confidence, his blunt humor masking the enormous pressure he carried on his shoulders. He had been tasked with protecting not only the fleet, but also the Army bombers, an unprecedented responsibility for a naval commander. Yet Halsey embraced the challenge, trusting in his men and the skill of Doolittle's aviators. His orders were simple but resolute: press forward, launch the bombers, and then withdraw before the Japanese could respond. The men trusted him because he had earned their respect in earlier battles, where his instincts and daring had proven sound. In the weeks ahead, his leadership would be tested as never before. But for now, his task was clear: deliver the raiders to striking distance, and he intended to see it through. Life aboard the task force in those tense weeks was a strange blend of routine and anticipation. Sailors drilled daily in gunnery exercises, damage control, and flight deck operations, maintaining readiness as the fleet pushed deeper into the Pacific. Army aviators kept busy with final preparations, studying maps of Japan, rehearsing flight plans, and running through emergency procedures. Friendships formed across service lines, with sailors teaching Army men the ways of shipboard life and airmen explaining the quirks of their bombers. Meals in the mess hall buzzed with speculation, laughter, and the occasional grim silence when thoughts turned to what lay ahead. Nights were restless, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, the stars overhead offering both beauty and a reminder of how far they were from home. In quiet moments, men wrote letters they knew might never be delivered, sealing them with the unspoken hope that someone would carry them back. Entertainment was scarce, but camaraderie was strong, and it carried them through the monotony of the voyage. The looming presence of the bombers on deck gave every day an air of unreality, as if the fleet were escorting a secret too large to name, and in truth, it was. By early April 1942, the task force had crossed thousands of miles, edging ever closer to enemy waters. The Pacific, once a buffer, now became a corridor of danger, patrolled by Japanese submarines and scouting planes. Halsey's fleet moved in silence, the hum of engines the only sound as they ploughed westward under grey skies and cold winds. Each day brought them closer to the launch point, closer to the moment when Doolittle's men would roar into the sky. The tension was palpable, a current running through every deck plate and gun turret. Yet beneath the anxiety lay pride in being chosen for something unprecedented, pride in striking back after Pearl Harbor. Sailors and airmen alike felt the weight of history pressing upon them. Soon the secret they carried would erupt in fire over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe. The task force was ready, its men hardened by discipline and united by purpose. Ahead lay risk, uncertainty, and the possibility of disaster. But ahead also lay redemption, delivered from the decks of the USS Hornet. The voyage across the Pacific was more than a simple transit. It was a journey into the heart of uncertainty, where every mile carried the task force deeper into danger. On April 2nd, 1942, the USS Hornet, laden with 16 Army B-25 bombers, lashed to her deck, slipped out of San Francisco Bay under cover of fog. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed above her as sailors and airmen gazed up, some silently praying, others simply awed by the enormity of their mission. Escorting her were the Enterprise, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and oilers, forming a steel spearhead pushing westward into enemy-dominated waters. From the moment they crossed the horizon, radio silence was absolute, a cone of secrecy surrounding the fleet. Orders were strict: no transmissions, no unnecessary lights at night, no signals that could betray their presence. Even within the ships, secrecy remained tight. Men speculated about their destination, but only a select few truly knew where they were headed. The Pacific, vast and empty, became both ally and adversary. Its immensity offered concealment, but it also magnified every danger. Japanese submarines prowled those waters, and reconnaissance planes searched the skies, seeking to uncover American movements. Every passing day brought the fleet closer to discovery, closer to the razor's edge of fate. Life aboard ship became a strange mix of monotony and mounting tension. Sailors drilled relentlessly in gunnery, firefighting, and damage control, their routines sharpened by the knowledge that at any moment alarms could sound for real. Army aircrews spent hours tending to their bombers, checking fuel tanks, retightening cables, and rehearsing short-deck takeoffs on the wooden planks of the Hornet. Meals were taken in silence more often than in chatter, the weight of secrecy pressing down even in the mess halls. Entertainment was scarce. No bands, no films, no distractions, save for conversation, cards, or the endless waves outside. Letters home were censored or forbidden, leaving men with thoughts unspoken, carried silently within them. At night, the fleet ran dark, extinguishing all lights, navigating only by compass, stars, and dim hooded lamps. The stillness of those nights, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of engines, created an atmosphere both eerie and awe-inspiring. Every man aboard knew he was part of something historic, yet the uncertainty of its outcome gnawed at even the bravest. Sleep was fitful, dreams filled with images of Tokyo's skyline, or visions of crashing into the sea. The Pacific stretched endlessly, a void that seemed to swallow time itself, and in that void, fear and determination grew side by side. The sailors of the Hornet faced challenges unlike any other carrier crew before them. Their flight deck, normally buzzing with agile naval fighters and bombers, was dominated by Army B-25 Psy, massive compared to the usual complement. Movement on deck had to be carefully choreographed, as there was little room for error among the wings and propellers jutting into walkways. Every storm or heavy swell threatened to jolt the bombers from their lashings, forcing deck crews to work tirelessly to secure them. Maintenance was constant, with oil leaking, bolts loosening, and salt air corroding exposed metal. Below decks, the ship's hangars, usually filled with spare aircraft, were stacked with supplies, bombs, and equipment needed for the mission. Sailors slept beside crates of fuel drums and stacks of high explosives, their bunks turned into storage space. The unusual presence of Army personnel created a cultural fusion, Navy discipline mingling with Army camaraderie, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in friction. Yet both sides respected the gravity of the mission, and differences were put aside in the face of shared danger. By the second week at sea, the Hornet felt less like a carrier and more like a floating fortress, carrying a secret payload to strike the heart of the enemy. Every man on board felt the weight of history pressing against the steel hull, and they bore it in silence. The escort ships added to the rhythm of the voyage, each vessel a vital part of the fleet's survival. Destroyers darted along the periphery, their crews constantly scanning sonar for the telltale echoes of submarines. Heavy cruisers stood ready with batteries of 8-inch guns, their turrets trained for surface raiders that might appear over the horizon. The Enterprise, Halsey's flagship, launched daily patrols of fighters and bombers, ensuring the skies above remained free of Japanese reconnaissance planes. Pilots flew endless circles, their eyes straining against the glare of sun and sea, searching for any sign of enemy activity. The oilers, slow and vulnerable, were lifelines of fuel, allowing the task force to sustain its relentless push westward. Each refueling was a delicate operation, ships maneuvering close together on rolling seas, hoses straining as black oil flowed from one to another. Sailors watched the horizon with tense eyes during these moments, knowing that discovery at such times would leave the fleet dangerously exposed. Yet luck held, and the Pacific seemed to shield them in its vastness. Every successful refueling brought them closer to Japan, closer to the moment of truth. The fleet moved as one organism, its heartbeat steady but quickening with anticipation, and still no enemy had seen them. For the men of the Army Air Forces, the voyage was both preparation and waiting. Pilots rehearsed takeoff sequences on the deck, practicing throttle bursts and brake releases in coordination with hand signals from Navy deck officers. Navigators studied their maps and charts by red lamp at night, memorizing coastlines, flight paths, and emergency procedures. Bombardiers practiced calculations with their stripped-down sights, knowing that accuracy would be critical in the smoke and chaos of Tokyo. Engineers checked and rechecked auxiliary fuel tanks, worried about leaks that could mean disaster in mid-flight. Gunners cleaned their weapons, though most knew their best defense would be surprise rather than firepower. Doolittle himself moved among them, calm and confident, answering questions, encouraging his men, and reminding them why they were there. His presence reassured them, his example showing that he would take the same risks they would. Yet beneath the calm routines lay an undercurrent of anxiety, unspoken but ever present. The knowledge that they might never return home lingered in every man's thoughts. They had volunteered, but the reality of that choice grew heavier with each mile closer to Japan, and still they trained, determined to be ready. Secrecy remained the fleet's greatest weapon, and discipline enforced it with relentless rigor. Radio operators monitored channels in silence, forbidden to transmit except in absolute emergency. Orders forbade smoking on deck after dark, the glow of a cigarette capable of betraying the fleet's position to a distant lookout. Gun crews remained at readiness, weapons loaded, in case a Japanese scout plane should suddenly appear. Lookouts strained their eyes against the horizon, their binoculars sweeping the endless waves hour after hour. When a distant ship was sighted, the fleet adjusted course to avoid detection, slipping silently through the ocean like a ghost armada. The tension was constant, a pressure that weighed on men's shoulders and sharpened their senses. Every sighting, every shadow, every glint on the horizon could mean discovery, interception, or annihilation. The Japanese Navy still dominated the Pacific, and a single encounter could bring disaster. Yet the fleet pressed on, guided by secrecy and determination, and every day that passed without detection was a victory in itself. As the fleet steamed westward, the psychological strain grew heavier, testing the endurance of even the toughest men. The monotony of the ocean, the sameness of the days, and the silence of secrecy created a mental fog that wore on nerves. Conversations often circled back to speculation. Would the mission succeed? Would they live to see home again? Would Japan even feel the blow? Some men distracted themselves with humor, telling jokes, pulling pranks, or betting cigarettes on trivial contests. Others grew more introspective, writing letters they might never send, or sitting alone on the deck staring into the horizon. Chaplains offered quiet comfort, listening to fears unspoken in the mess hall. Officers kept discipline tight, understanding that idle minds could turn fear into panic. Yet through the unease, a sense of pride grew stronger, binding men together with the knowledge that they carried the hopes of a wounded nation. They were not just sailors and aviators, they were instruments of history, and history weighed heavily even as it inspired. By mid-April, the fleet had pushed to within striking range of the Japanese homeland, though no one knew exactly when the order to launch would come. Halsey monitored reports of enemy movements with the intensity of a man carrying the weight of a nation's hopes. Doolittle reviewed flight plans again and again, ensuring no detail had been overlooked. The men grew restless, aware that the longer they sailed, the greater the chance of discovery. Yet anticipation sharpened them, turning anxiety into readiness, fear into determination. The Pacific, once endless and monotonous, now felt like a battlefield in waiting, every wave hiding unseen enemies. Soon the silence would be broken, and the secret carried across thousands of miles would erupt into fire over Tokyo. The voyage had been long, tense, and filled with peril, but the fleet had endured. The impossible was now within reach. And as dawn after dawn broke over the Pacific, the raiders in their bombers looked east toward Japan, ready for history. The morning of April 18th, 1942, dawned grey and cold as the task force pushed westward through the swells of the Pacific. The raiders had been told the launch would take place within 400 to 500 miles of Japan, a range that offered both tactical surprise and a slim margin for fuel. But fate, as it often does in war, intervened sooner than expected. At 7:38 a.m., lookouts aboard the cruiser Nashville sighted a small Japanese picket boat on the horizon, a converted fishing trawler bristling with radio equipment. These pickets were part of Japan's early warning net, stationed far from home waters to provide crucial hours of notice against American incursions. Guns opened fire almost immediately, blasting the wooden vessel into flames, but not before its operators had begun transmitting frantic signals. Sailors aboard American ships could only watch as smoke rose from the wreckage, knowing the warning had already gone out. Halsey on the Enterprise received word within minutes and grasped the grim reality. The task force had been discovered, and secrecy, their greatest shield, was now gone. The mission could not be delayed. Admiral Halsey, a man known for boldness, understood instantly that indecision would mean disaster. Japanese naval forces could converge quickly if the picket's transmission had been received, and the task force was still over 650 miles from Tokyo. Waiting longer risked interception by carriers or cruisers that could annihilate the Hornet and its vulnerable bombers. His choices were stark: withdraw and abandon the mission, or launch immediately at extreme range. Halsey chose without hesitation, sending the now famous signal, "Launch bombers." The order traveled swiftly across the fleet, relayed from deck to deck, until it reached the Hornet, where Doolittle and his men stood ready. The decision was both daring and desperate, gambling men's lives against the need for a strike. By launching so far out, the raiders would almost certainly lack fuel to reach safe bases in China. Yet to turn back would surrender the first opportunity to strike Japan, a blow Roosevelt and the nation desperately needed. Halsey's gamble was not merely military, it was psychological, political, and moral, and once the order was given, there was no turning back. On the deck of the USS Hornet, tension turned to urgent activity as the launch preparations began. The sea was rough, waves pitching the carrier's deck as crews rushed to ready the first bomber. Sailors strained at ropes and cables, removing the last lashings that had secured the aircraft through the long voyage. Army pilots climbed into cockpits, engines coughing to life in a roar of smoke and vibration. Propellers spun furiously, whipping salt spray into the faces of sailors crouching on deck. The smell of gasoline and oil filled the air, mingled with the acrid scent of exhaust. Signal flags waved, guiding each bomber forward into position as the carrier angled into the wind to provide maximum lift. Below decks, men gathered in silence, knowing that every launch was a razor's edge between success and disaster. On the bridge, Captain Mark Mitcher watched with grim focus, his responsibility tied to every plane that rolled forward. Doolittle himself climbed into the lead bomber, determined to be first into the sky, to set the example for his men. The impossible was about to become reality, under conditions harsher than anyone had intended. The reduced range weighed heavily on the crews, though many only realized the full implications after the order was given. Originally planned to launch from within 450 miles, they were now forced to take off more than 200 miles further out. That extra distance meant hours more flying time, and with fuel tanks already stretched to maximum, margins were now razor thin. Navigators recalculated frantically, scribbling numbers on maps and charts, weighing headwinds against the fuel burn of heavy aircraft. Some whispered grimly that they would not reach China at all, that their best hope would be to ditch in the sea or crash land in occupied territory. Doolittle, calm as ever, reassured his men with quiet confidence, telling them that success lay not in survival, but in the strike itself. His words carried weight, though each man knew the danger was real. They had trained for the impossible, but this was beyond even those calculations. Fuel gauges would decide their fate long after bombs were dropped, and the knowledge that many might not return gave the mission a tragic nobility. The Japanese picket boats themselves were a testament to Japan's far-reaching defensive net. Stretching across hundreds of miles, these small craft, often converted whalers or fishing trawlers, bristled with radios and light weapons. Manned by sailors hardened by long weeks at sea, their task was both monotonous and critical: to watch for American incursions and give early warning. Though primitive in armament, their radios could carry signals that shifted the balance of war. When the Nito Maru, the Pickets sunk that morning, flashed its frantic signal, Japanese commanders received only fragments before the vessel went silent. Yet even fragments were enough to alert Tokyo that something unusual was approaching from the east. The irony was bitter. The destruction of the Picket all but confirmed to the Japanese that an enemy force was near. Sailors aboard the American fleet cursed the unlucky encounter, but in truth, such a sighting was inevitable in the vast Pacific. The picket line had been Japan's shield, and on that morning it worked as intended. What mattered now was speed, surprise, and determination, and the Americans still had all three. As Doolittle's bomber prepared to launch, the atmosphere on the Hornet's deck shifted into a mix of fear and exhilaration. Sailors stood at the railings, holding their breath as the engines thundered, wheels straining against chocks. A wave of the signal flag, a release of brakes, and the bomber lurched forward, gathering speed across the pitching deck. Men shouted encouragement over the roar, watching as the plane's wheels hit the final painted line. For a moment it seemed the bomber might plunge into the sea, nose dipping toward the waves. Then the wings caught air, the engines roared higher, and the plane clawed skyward, rising into the grey morning. A cheer erupted, sailors clapping, shouting, some even weeping with relief. One by one the other bombers followed, each launch a gamble against physics and fate. Engines strained, decks trembled, and propellers blurred into silver discs, and each time, against the odds, the bombers rose into the sky. Behind the launches lay the grim awareness that fuel shortages would shape the mission's end. The raiders knew they were flying toward targets they could strike, but their return journey was uncertain at best. Each man carried a survival kit, a pistol, and the knowledge that China's vast terrain might be their only refuge. Some joked darkly about bailing out over rice fields, others quietly prepared for capture or death. Doolittle himself admitted privately to expecting a court-martial if the raid failed, believing he had asked too much of his men. Yet failure was not an option. Striking Japan was the true goal, survival the uncertain aftermath. As the last bomber lifted into the sky, the Hornet's deck was eerily empty, its unusual cargo gone. Sailors looked upward, shading their eyes against the pale morning light, watching the formation fade into the horizon. The task force had fulfilled its role, but the bombers now carried the burden of fate. What happened next would be written in fire over Tokyo, and in the courage of men flying with almost no fuel to spare. The decision to launch early defined the raid, shaping both its triumph and its tragedy. Halsey's boldness ensured the bombers reached Japan, striking a blow that electrified the world and stunned the Japanese high command. But the cost was exacted in fuel, forcing crews to fly into darkness, storms and uncertainty, with little hope of reaching safe ground. Many would crash, some would die, and others would be captured, their fate sealed the moment that Picket boat was sighted. Yet had Halsey delayed, the entire task force might have been destroyed by the Japanese Navy, erasing the chance to strike at all. In that calculation lay the cruel arithmetic of war: risk everything for the chance of victory, or risk nothing and guarantee defeat. The raiders accepted the gamble, their courage carrying them into skies where odds favored failure. As the fleet turned away, retreating eastward into the vast Pacific, the bombers pushed west into history. The early detection had changed the mission, but not its spirit. What mattered was that American bombers were now in the air, heading straight for Tokyo, and nothing could turn them back. The morning of April 18th, 1942, was raw and grey, the Pacific heaving under heavy seas as the USS Hornet ploughed forward. Sailors awoke to the piercing cold of salt wind, and the knowledge that this was the day destiny would unfold. Waves crashed against the bow, sending sheets of spray across the flight deck, where 16 B-25 sat, their fuselages gleaming with moisture. Engines coughed and roared to life, filling the air with the deafening symphony of radial cylinders straining at full throttle. On the bridge, Captain Mark Mitcher watched with narrowed eyes, calculating every roll of the ship as the deck pitched up and down. The risk was magnified by the weather, for a mistimed launch could hurl a bomber straight into the sea. Doolittle, standing in his cockpit, strapped himself in and checked his gauges, his face set in calm determination. He knew his men were watching him, and if he faltered, so might they. Below, sailors crowded railings and gun tubs, their eyes fixed on the strange sight of army bombers, readying for flight from a carrier. Silence fell as the first chocks were pulled, and the deck officer raised his signal flag. The impossible was about to begin. At 8:20 a.m. With the Hornet angled into the wind, Doolittle's bomber rolled forward. The engines howled as the plane lumbered across the short, wet deck, straining against gravity's pull. The bow dipped into a trough of waves, just as the bomber neared the edge, creating the illusion of a deadly plunge. Sailors held their breath, some whispering prayers, as the wheels left the deck with only feet to spare. For a moment the bomber seemed to hang, nose dipping toward the sea. Then the wings bit the wind and lifted her skyward. A roar of relief and cheers erupted across the carrier, men clapping and shouting as Doolittle climbed into the grey sky. His takeoff had proved it could be done, erasing doubt and filling the air with a sense of awe. In that moment, leadership was more than rank. It was example embodied by the man who had chosen to fly first. Above the fleet, his bomber banked slightly, waiting for others to follow, its engines echoing like a promise across the Pacific. The raiders now had their path, and one by one they would take it. The second bomber followed closely, its pilot tense but buoyed by Doolittle's success. The deck officer signaled, chocks dropped, and the engines roared against the pitching sea. Again the carrier rolled with the swells, the wooden planks slick with salt spray, as the bomber gathered speed. Men on deck shouted encouragement, waving arms and fists, as the aircraft surged forward. Its wheels struck the last painted marker and leapt free, nose bobbing before settling into steady flight. Relief swept through the crowd again, though the tension remained sharp with each successive launch. Every aircraft carried 5 men and the hopes of a nation, and each departure was a gamble against sea, wind, and weight. The bomber's wings skimmed low over the waves, engines straining before climbing into formation. Sailors exhaled only when the plane lifted high enough to clear the danger. The launches became a rhythm, each one feeding courage into the next, and in that rhythm, the impossible became routine. By the 4th bomber, confidence replaced dread on the flight deck, though no one forgot how thin the margin remained. Engines screamed, propellers blurred, and men leaned forward as if willing each plane into the air. Deck crews moved with practiced precision, guiding each bomber to its mark, hand signals cutting through the roar. Pilots tightened their grips on throttles, eyes fixed on the deck's edge as waves rose and fell beyond. The Hornet's bow pitched violently, yet timing and skill carried each bomber into the sky. When the 7th aircraft launched, sailors began clapping even before wheels left the deck, their faith now stronger than fear. Still, each takeoff carried peril, and silence always returned the instant a bomber rolled forward. Gunners on destroyers and cruisers craned their necks to watch, knowing they were witnessing something historic. The bombers formed a growing pattern in the sky, circling like hawks gathering for a strike. The sight electrified every man who saw it, and it carved itself into memory as the moment America's resolve took wing. The air grew thick with exhaust as the launches continued, each bomber rising like a defiance, hurled against the Pacific itself. Some planes wobbled dangerously as they cleared the deck, their wings dipping close to the waves before engines steadied them. Others lifted smoothly, seemingly eager to leap skyward, as if guided by unseen hands. On the carrier's deck, the crews worked with relentless focus, moving aircraft into position with steel nerves. No one allowed themselves the luxury of distraction, for a single mistake could kill 5 men and block the deck for all others. Sweat mixed with sea spray on the faces of sailors as they pushed, hauled, and guided the massive bombers forward. Their work was silent but vital, the unseen choreography that made each launch possible. In the air, bombers formed a loose column, waiting for stragglers to join before heading west. Their bellies carried bombs destined for Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe, each weapon a message written in fire. Men on deck watched them grow smaller, specks against a vast grey sky. The fleet remained behind, but the mission now carried forward, and with each launch, history's weight lifted into the air. By the 10th bomber, fatigue began to set in on the crews. Though adrenaline kept them sharp, the roar of engines had become constant, vibrating through the steel hull and into the bones of every man aboard. Sailors shouted to one another over the deafening thunder, their voices lost in the maelstrom. The deck reeked of gasoline and oil, a potent reminder of how fragile success truly was. Yet with each departure, relief spread wider, as the line of bombers on deck grew shorter. Officers tracked progress, checking names and aircraft numbers, ensuring none were left behind. Below decks, men unable to watch strained to hear the sound of cheers, marking each successful launch. Above, Doolittle's bomber circled, joined by growing numbers of comrades, waiting to form the strike force. The Pacific horizon was now dotted with American planes, a sight no Japanese eye had yet seen. The impossible had been accomplished again and again, until it no longer seemed impossible at all. By the 12th launch, even the most hardened skeptics knew it was working, and morale surged with every roaring takeoff. The final bombers rolled forward in quick succession, their crews gripping controls with steady hands. The sea remained restless, waves rising and falling as the Hornet plowed ahead. Each aircraft thundered down the deck, lifted into the wind, and climbed steadily toward the formation. The 16th and last bomber, engines straining, roared across the wooden planks as sailors shouted encouragement with every foot gained. Wheels left the deck, the plane dipped briefly, then lifted, catching the air as cheers erupted once more. The deck fell silent, the bombers gone, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the echo of engines fading into the distance. Sailors embraced, shook hands, and shouted, their relief unrestrained now that all had made it aloft. Above, the 16 bombers gathered into formation, circling the fleet once before turning west toward Japan. From the decks below, men gazed upward, shading their eyes, watching history vanish into the horizon. The Hornet had fulfilled her impossible duty, and the raiders now carried the mission alone. For the men aboard the fleet, watching the bombers fade into the distance was both triumph and terror. Triumph because they had witnessed the impossible, a carrier launching 16 army bombers into combat. Terror because they knew what awaited those bombers. Hundreds of miles of ocean, enemy fighters, flak, and the dwindling promise of fuel. The sailors returned to their stations, guns ready, eyes scanning the horizon for Japanese retaliation. The task force would now retreat eastward at maximum speed, racing to escape detection and destruction. Doolittle and his men flew westward into danger and glory. The Pacific stretched between them like a chasm, separating those who had watched from those who would fight. The launch was over, but the mission had only begun, and with it began one of the most daring chapters in American military history. The approach to Japan on April 18th, 1942, was cloaked in clouds and tension, the bombers flying low over the Pacific to avoid detection. For hours the crews had stared at endless ocean, fuel gauges dropping steadily, each man calculating silently whether they would even reach land. Then, near noon, the first faint outline of Japan's coastline emerged through the haze, a sight both breathtaking and terrifying. The navigators' charts and calculations had held true, bringing them to the shores of their enemy. Below stretched fertile fields, small villages, and rail lines, the heart of an empire that had seemed untouchable. Doolittle, flying in the lead aircraft, adjusted his course toward Tokyo, his crew straining for a glimpse of the sprawling city ahead. Behind him, other bombers angled toward Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, each crew assigned to a target chosen for its military or industrial value. The bomb bays were armed with a mix of high-explosive and incendiary bombs, modest in quantity but powerful in symbolism. Crews checked their sights, adjusted altimeters, and tightened their grips on controls as they descended into Japanese airspace. The mission had now shifted from survival to strike, and in minutes America's answer to Pearl Harbor would fall upon Japan's cities. Over Tokyo, air raid sirens began to wail, their mournful cry rising above the midday bustle of the capital. Japanese civilians looked upward in disbelief as silver aircraft swept across the sky, engines roaring, bombs suddenly tumbling from their bellies. Anti-aircraft batteries fired sporadically, their crews caught off guard by the appearance of American planes so far from any known front. Explosions thundered through the city as bombs struck industrial districts, igniting warehouses, fuel depots, and factories. Columns of smoke spiraled upward, staining the sky black, while fire brigades raced to contain spreading flames. Civilians scattered in panic, clutching children, pulling carts, fleeing into side streets as the reality of war reached their doorstep. For many, it was the first time the home islands had felt foreign bombs, shattering the illusion of invulnerability. In government offices, officials scrambled to make sense of the attack, their disbelief as heavy as their fear. The bombers flew low, banking hard to release their payloads with precision, then climbing away before enemy fighters could intercept. Doolittle's aircraft dropped incendiaries on a factory district, igniting fires that raged long after the bomber was gone. The psychological shock was immediate, far outweighing the limited destruction. Japan had been struck, and nothing would erase that truth. Meanwhile, Yokohama, only a short distance from Tokyo, felt the sting of American bombs as another formation roared overhead. The city's docks, warehouses, and industrial facilities were prime targets. Their destruction meant to ripple through Japan's war economy. Explosions tore through waterfront structures, scattering debris and sending workers fleeing in chaos. Anti-aircraft fire opened up from harbor defenses, black bursts dotting the sky as bombers weaved through with remarkable coolness. In one aircraft, a bombardier released his payload on oil storage tanks, flames leaping skyward in a fireball seen for miles. Gunners scanned the skies nervously, expecting interceptors, but Japanese fighters scrambled too late to intercept the swift raid. Civilians, unused to such terror, ran through smoke-filled streets, eyes wide with shock, mouths covered against the choking fumes. The sight of American markings on wings overhead burned into memory, a symbol of humiliation and fear. In Yokohama's factories, workers abandoned machines, their productivity halted not by destruction but by panic. The raid's physical impact was small, but the disruption was immense, proving that fear could be as damaging as fire. And as the bombers vanished toward the west, the city was left trembling in disbelief. Nagoya, home to aircraft manufacturing and heavy industry, became another target of the raiders. The city had been a center of Japan's aviation production, making it a symbolic and strategic objective. Bombs fell on factories, workshops, and storage areas, igniting scattered fires across the industrial quarter. Workers fled into the streets, some shouting warnings, others frozen in shock as explosions rattled windows and walls. Anti-aircraft guns barked angrily from the outskirts, but the bombers pressed on, flying at altitudes too low for effective interception. In one aircraft, a crewman described seeing workers waving fists and pointing skyward, their anger mingled with fear. Fires spread through wooden structures, flames leaping from roof to roof, magnified by the dry spring winds. Rail lines were struck in the chaos, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air, halting transport temporarily. Though damage assessments would later reveal minimal long-term destruction, the immediate disruption was unmistakable. Nagoya, like Tokyo and Yokohama, had been violated by foreign aircraft, and for a nation told its skies were impenetrable, that violation cut deep. Kobe, an industrial and port city, faced its own moment of terror as the last wave of bombers descended. Warehouses, shipyards, and industrial plants bore the brunt of the attack, with incendiaries setting fire to dockside facilities. Flames leapt skyward as bombs detonated among storage tanks, their explosions sending shockwaves across the harbor. Japanese sailors scrambled aboard ships, some firing rifles skyward in desperation, others racing to save their vessels from spreading fires. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke, but the bombers darted through with minimal damage. Civilians on the docks ran for cover, diving into alleys, shelters, or simply throwing themselves flat as explosions shook the ground. Smoke obscured the skyline, mingling with cries of fear and the roar of fire engines clattering across cobblestones. The raid lasted only minutes, yet it left a scar on the city's psyche. For the first time, Kobe's people understood that the Pacific was no longer a barrier, but a highway for danger. Factories ground to a halt, commerce froze, and morale cracked under the weight of fear. The physical damage could be repaired. The psychological wound would linger far longer. For the Japanese military, the shock of the raids was compounded by disbelief at their origin. Intelligence officers and commanders scrambled to explain how American bombers had penetrated so deep into home territory. Some speculated they had come from secret bases in China or Russia, while others believed carriers had brought them closer than anyone thought possible. The truth that Army bombers had launched from a carrier deck was almost unthinkable, defying Japanese naval doctrine. In Tokyo, military leaders convened emergency meetings, their anger directed as much at themselves as at the enemy. They realized that their defensive net of picket boats, submarines, and aircraft patrols had failed. The illusion of an invincible homeland, carefully nurtured since Pearl Harbor, had been shattered in broad daylight. Civilians had witnessed American planes over their heads, and panic had spread faster than flames. The raid itself caused little lasting damage to infrastructure, but the blow to prestige was devastating. Japan's leaders now faced a dangerous truth. The war had come home, and their people knew it. For civilians, the raids were unforgettable, searing events that would mark their memories for life. Housewives clutching children, factory workers sprinting through smoke, shopkeepers watching glass shatter, and walls crumble, all became part of a collective trauma. Few had ever seen foreign aircraft, and now they saw bombs exploding in their neighborhoods, their workplaces, their streets. The fear was compounded by confusion, as rumors spread faster than facts. Stories of massive fleets offshore, whispers of thousands of planes ready to strike again. Families huddled in shelters, eyes wide in terror, ears ringing from distant explosions. The Japanese government moved quickly to suppress panic, announcing that the raids had been minor and the damage minimal. Yet people had seen the fires, heard the bombs, and felt the terror in their bones. Trust in official assurances, weakened as reality proved otherwise. For the first time, ordinary Japanese citizens felt what their empire had inflicted on others, the vulnerability of being bombed, and it shook them deeply. The Doolittle Raid's physical results were modest, fewer than 50 buildings destroyed, dozens damaged, and production disrupted only temporarily. But its psychological impact was seismic, a tremor that rippled from civilians in Tokyo to generals in Tokyo Bay. Japan's vaunted defenses had been pierced, its cities bombed, its people frightened in broad daylight. The American strike, small in scale, had achieved what months of propaganda could not. It proved Japan was vulnerable. Roosevelt's gamble had paid off, electrifying American morale while sowing unease within the Japanese high command. The shockwaves of the raid reached far beyond the damage inflicted, influencing strategy, priorities, and perceptions on both sides of the Pacific. For the raiders watching the smoke fade behind them, the mission's symbolic success was clear. They had carried America's anger across the ocean and delivered it to Japan's heart. Yet as they turned toward China, the harsh reality returned. Their fuel was running low, and survival was far from certain. The strike had succeeded, but the real test was still ahead. The exhilaration of striking Japan faded quickly as the raiders turned westward, leaving smoke and chaos behind them. Their bomb bays were empty, but their fuel tanks were dangerously low, drained by the early launch hundreds of miles beyond the planned point. Navigators recalculated again and again, pencils scratching on charts, as they tried to stretch every drop of gasoline toward China. Headwinds slowed progress, each gust stealing precious miles from the already fragile margins. Radios remained silent, for the bombers had no way to communicate with one another once the strike was complete. Crews sat in tense silence, each man glancing at the fuel gauges that dropped steadily with no hope of refilling. The Pacific stretched below them, endless and merciless, while clouds began to gather in dark, heavy banks ahead. Hope lay in the promise of Chinese airfields prepared for their arrival, but those bases were farther than ever before. In cockpits and cabins, men exchanged nervous glances, unspoken fears rising with every passing hour. They had struck their blow, but now they had to survive the flight home. As night fell, the weather turned against them, compounding an already desperate situation. Storm clouds rolled in across the Chinese coastline, thick and unbroken, shrouding landmarks and obscuring navigational beacons. Rain lashed against windshields, turning glass into sheets of water that blurred the horizon. Lightning flickered across the skies, illuminating cockpits for brief moments before plunging them back into darkness. Instruments became the only lifeline, needles trembling with the turbulence as pilots fought to keep wings level. Navigators, deprived of visual fixes, clung to dead reckoning, guessing their position based on speed, heading, and time. Some crews drifted off course entirely, carried by wind and error into unfamiliar skies. Hope of finding prepared Chinese airfields dwindled with every mile, for weather and darkness made landfall almost impossible to pinpoint. The bombers pressed onward blindly, knowing that to turn back was impossible, and to continue was nearly suicidal. Each crew now faced the grim reality that survival would depend on improvisation, instinct, and fate. Fuel gauges sank into the red, the needles barely holding above empty, a silent countdown toward disaster. Pilots coaxed every mile from their engines, leaning fuel mixtures, throttling back when possible, gliding whenever winds allowed. Crewmen sat in tense silence, eyes fixed on gauges, ears straining for the sputter that would mean the end. Some aircraft flickered in and out of power as fuel tanks sloshed dry, engines coughing before recovering briefly. Conversations were hushed, a mixture of prayer, grim humor, and quiet resignation. Doolittle himself, leading the formation, realized the inevitable. None of the planes had enough fuel to reach their designated airfields. He told his men to prepare for bailout, knowing it was the only choice left. Across other bombers, similar decisions were made in tense whispers between pilots and navigators: bail out into the storm and risk injury, or ride the aircraft into the ground and hope for a survivable crash landing. It was a choice no training had ever fully prepared them for, yet every man knew it was coming. The order to bail out was one of the most difficult any commander could give, yet it echoed across cockpits that night. Crews strapped on parachutes in cramped bomb bays, adjusting harnesses with trembling hands in the flickering glow of instrument lights. Pilots trimmed their planes for stability, buying their men a few precious seconds to leap into the storm. One by one, hatches opened, and men threw themselves into the black void, swallowed instantly by wind and rain. Some shouted encouragement as they jumped, their words lost in the roar of engines and the rush of air. Others leapt in silence, clenching teeth and praying parachutes would open before the ground rose to meet them. The fear was primal, the plunge into darkness more terrifying than enemy fire had ever been. Yet it was the only path to survival, and so they jumped. Doolittle himself was among those who bailed, tumbling through the night sky before his chute blossomed above him. For the raiders, their mission had ended in triumph over Tokyo, but now it became a fight for individual survival in the storm. Not all crews managed to bail out safely. Some chose to ditch their aircraft, guiding them toward rivers, fields, or open ground. One bomber came down hard on a rice paddy, its fuselage breaking apart as mud and water engulfed it. Another slammed into a hillside, scattering wreckage across the slope in a fiery glow visible for miles. A few attempted water landings, their planes skimming rivers before cartwheeling into destruction. For those who survived such crashes, escape was a frantic scramble, men clawing free from twisted wreckage, drenched in rain and fuel. Injuries were common, broken bones, concussions and burns, but many still staggered away into the night. Others were not so fortunate, their lives ending in the violent impact of machines too heavy to glide. Each crash added to the cost of the raid, a price paid not in bombs but in blood and broken bodies. Yet every man who tried knew he had carried the mission as far as humanly possible. The rest was fate, and fate was merciless in those dark hours. As dawn broke, survivors found themselves scattered across the Chinese countryside, exhausted, disoriented, and desperate. Some landed near villages, where Chinese civilians rushed to help them, despite the danger of Japanese reprisals. Others stumbled into fields alone, soaked and battered, calling out in vain for their crewmates. Parachutes dangled from trees, white silk catching the morning light as landmarks of the night's chaos. Many hid quickly, aware that Japanese patrols would soon be searching for them. Local farmers risked their lives to guide the raiders to safety, offering food, shelter, and directions toward Chinese forces. Injured men were carried on makeshift stretchers, their pain endured in silence as they fled deeper inland. The kindness of strangers became the thin line between survival and capture. For the raiders, the mission had not ended with the bombs. It had only shifted into a struggle across hostile territory. Each step into China carried both hope and peril, and survival was never guaranteed. A few bombers, unable to reach China, diverted toward the Soviet Union, hoping for sanctuary. One aircraft landed in Vladivostok, its crew relieved to have survived, only to find themselves interned by Soviet authorities. The USSR, bound by its non-aggression pact with Japan, could not openly harbor the Americans without risking diplomatic fallout. The men were treated decently, but held under close watch, pawns in the larger game of global strategy. Their fate was markedly different from comrades in China, who faced pursuit and reprisal from Japanese forces. Yet their aircraft, intact and captured, offered the Soviets a valuable glimpse into American aviation. This divergence of outcomes highlighted the unpredictable nature of the mission's aftermath. Some raiders became heroes sheltered by allies, others prisoners trapped by geopolitics. All had gambled their lives in service of a strike that demanded extraordinary sacrifice. And the gamble continued long after the last bomb had fallen. The long flight to China was the true crucible of the Doolittle Raid, a test not of machines but of men. The bombing had been audacious, but survival required endurance, resilience, and luck beyond calculation. Crews scattered across mountains, rivers, and villages, each facing their own struggle to evade capture and find safety. Fuel gauges, storms, and navigation errors had conspired against them, leaving them stranded in hostile territory. Yet the spirit that had carried them across the Pacific still burned in their will to survive. They had risked everything to strike Japan, and now they risked everything again, simply to live another day. The raid's legacy was not written only in the fires of Tokyo, but in the desperate landings, the broken bodies, and the silent determination of men pushing beyond exhaustion. In those moments, the raiders ceased to be aviators alone. They became survivors of an ordeal as unforgiving as war itself. Their story did not end with the raid. It continued in the mud of China, in the hands of strangers, and in the fragile hope of making it home. As dawn broke over China on April 19, 1942, scattered crews of the Doolittle Raid began the desperate fight for survival. Parachutes littered hillsides and valleys, white silk draped across trees and rooftops, markers of the night's chaos. Many airmen stumbled into villages, dazed and battered, their uniforms torn, their bodies bruised from hard landings. Chinese civilians, though frightened by the sudden appearance of foreigners, quickly grasped who these men were. Word spread from village to village that Americans had struck Japan, and local farmers stepped forward to aid them. Food was offered, wounds were bandaged, and directions toward safety were whispered despite the risk of Japanese reprisals. Some survivors were hidden in barns or caves, protected by peasants who understood the danger of discovery. Children acted as guides, leading downed airmen across rice paddies and mountain trails to rendezvous with Chinese guerrillas. The kindness shown often meant life or death, for without help, many raiders would have perished in isolation. The mission's survival phase became a story not only of American bravery, but of Chinese sacrifice. And every rescued raider carried the memory of those who risked everything for them. Yet salvation was fragile, for Japanese patrols scoured the countryside in relentless pursuit. Columns of soldiers moved through villages, their rifles slung, their eyes searching for signs of foreigners. Airmen hiding in huts or fields could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the shouts of orders, the metallic clink of bayonets. At times, escape came only by seconds, villagers smuggling Americans out the back. As soldiers marched through the front, some raiders disguised themselves in local clothes, hats pulled low, their pale faces hidden beneath scarves. Others relied on sheer endurance, trudging for days across mountains and rivers, guided only by faith and instinct. Japanese reprisals were brutal. Entire villages suspected of helping the raiders were punished with executions and massacres. The airmen understood that their presence brought death to those who aided them, a burden that weighed heavily on their conscience. Survival was not only a physical challenge, but a moral torment, knowing that their rescue cost innocent lives. And yet, without the courage of ordinary Chinese peasants, few would have escaped. The line between survival and capture was razor thin, marked by chance and sacrifice. Some crews found themselves fortunate, rescued by organized Chinese guerrilla networks tied to the nationalist army. These groups, hardened by years of fighting the Japanese occupation, guided the raiders across rugged terrain toward friendly zones. They provided food, weapons, and escorts, moving secretly through mountain passes and forested trails. Communication was limited, but hand signals and gestures carried meaning, binding the Americans to their protectors. Together they endured hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of Japanese ambush. At night, campfires were hidden, and sentries stood watch, guarding against surprise attacks. For the raiders, the journey was grueling, yet hope remained alive with every step away from enemy lines. Bonds were forged in silence, friendships formed between men who shared only courage and a common enemy. These alliances of survival highlighted the global nature of the war, where strangers became comrades under fire. Each mile gained toward safety was a triumph against overwhelming odds, and each rescued raider carried with him a debt that could never be repaid. But not all were so lucky, for some crews fell into Japanese hands and faced a fate far darker. 8 raiders were captured, betrayed by circumstance and misfortune as they tried to evade patrols. Dragged into custody, they were paraded as trophies, their uniforms stripped, their dignity assaulted. Interrogations were merciless, demanding confessions that the men refused to give. Beatings, starvation, and torture followed, the Japanese seeking propaganda victories as well as intelligence, for the captured captivity was a test of will, endurance, and loyalty to their comrades. In Shanghai, military tribunals were convened, condemning the airmen as war criminals rather than prisoners of war. 3 of the men were executed by firing squad, their sacrifice sealing the cost of the raid in blood. The others were sentenced to years of imprisonment under brutal conditions, suffering illness, isolation, and psychological torment. The fate of these raiders became a symbol of the raid's grim aftermath, and their endurance embodied the price of striking Japan. The executions were carried out in secrecy, hidden from the world by Japanese authorities desperate to conceal the truth. Yet whispers escaped, carried by underground networks and sympathetic civilians who risked death to spread word. Families back in the United States waited in agony, uncertain whether their loved ones had survived or perished. Official silence shrouded the truth for months, leaving grief to fester in uncertainty. For the men imprisoned, survival became a daily battle against despair as much as hunger. Letters were forbidden, contact denied, and hope rationed as tightly as food. Yet even in captivity, the raiders held to their oath, refusing to betray comrades or dishonor their mission. Some marked days with scratches on walls, clinging to the passage of time as a tether to sanity. Others prayed, sang quietly, or replayed memories of home in their minds to keep despair at bay. Their survival was not just physical but spiritual, a defiance against the cruelty of their captors, and their endurance honored the mission's courage in ways the world would only later learn. For those who evaded capture, survival remained a constant uncertainty in the days and weeks that followed. They trekked across rivers swollen with spring rains, their boots soaked, their bodies racked with fatigue. Hunger gnawed at their strength, forcing them to eat scraps, roots, or whatever Chinese allies could provide. Some suffered injuries from crash landings, limping on broken bones or nursing wounds as they staggered toward safety. Yet determination pushed them onward, the belief that survival meant their mission's success would not be in vain. Chinese guerrillas guided them through Japanese lines, often fighting skirmishes to protect their charges. Entire communities shouldered the burden, moving raiders secretly through networks of resistance. These efforts cost thousands of Chinese lives, as Japanese reprisals swept through villages in waves of brutality. The scale of sacrifice was immense, though largely unseen by the world at the time, and in the shadows of that sacrifice, American survival became possible. The raid's aftermath was as much a Chinese tragedy as an American victory. The story of survival and capture revealed the dual nature of the Doolittle Raid's legacy. It was not only a daring strike, but a chain of human stories stretching across 2 continents. For some airmen, survival meant the kindness of strangers, the courage of peasants, and the solidarity of resistance fighters. For others, it meant imprisonment, torture, and the ultimate sacrifice in a foreign land. The Japanese response demonstrated the lengths to which an empire would go to protect its pride. Yet the Americans' endurance proved the depth of their resolve, a reminder that courage could not be extinguished by fear. Villagers who aided them paid with their lives, their heroism often forgotten but never diminished in significance. The bond between raider and rescuer became a testament to shared humanity amid the cruelty of war. And in every account the same truth emerged. Survival was not guaranteed, but honor was preserved. By the time the surviving raiders reached safety, the mission had transformed from an audacious strike into a saga of endurance. News of their ordeal would not reach America in full detail for months, yet already the raid had achieved its goal. Japan had been shocked, its defenses rattled, its civilians awakened to war on their doorstep. The cost, however, had been steep. Lives lost in battle, in capture and in the reprisals that swept across China. The airmen who survived carried scars, physical and emotional, but also pride in what they had accomplished. They knew their mission had inspired a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, giving hope where despair had reigned, and they knew too that their story was only one part of a much larger war. Yet in that story lay the essence of sacrifice, courage, and endurance. The Doolittle Raid's legacy was written not only in bombs but in blood, sweat, and survival, and its heroes were found not just in cockpits but in villages, prisons, and fields across Asia. The success of the Doolittle Raid enraged Japanese leaders, who viewed the attack not only as a military humiliation but as a personal affront to the emperor himself. For the first time, Japanese cities had burned under foreign bombs, and the illusion of invulnerability was shattered. Determined to punish those responsible, Tokyo ordered a campaign of terror against the Chinese provinces suspected of aiding the raiders. This operation, later called the Zhejiang Genji campaign, was as ruthless as it was calculated. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers poured into central China, sweeping across villages and farmlands with brutal efficiency. Their orders were clear: root out resistance, destroy infrastructure, and annihilate anyone who had helped the Americans. Entire communities, suspected of harboring airmen, became targets for collective punishment. Homes were torched, crops burned, and livestock slaughtered, erasing livelihoods in a single wave of violence. Civilians who had offered food or shelter to raiders were executed on the spot, often before their families. The campaign was not a battle, but a massacre, and its cruelty scarred China for generations. The scale of atrocities was staggering, with entire villages reduced to ashes in the name of vengeance. Japanese units swept through Zhejiang and Zhejiangxi provinces, bayoneting civilians, beheading prisoners, and burning entire towns to the ground. Farmers, teachers, and children were rounded up, accused of aiding Americans, and slaughtered in public squares. The elderly were cut down without mercy, and women were subjected to unspeakable violence before being killed. Families who had once welcomed the raiders into their homes paid with their lives, their generosity punished in blood. Eyewitness accounts told of wells poisoned with corpses, bodies left as warnings to others who might dare resist. The destruction extended beyond people to infrastructure, with bridges demolished, canals ruined, and harvests destroyed. Japanese forces deliberately unleashed famine, ensuring survivors would suffer long after the soldiers moved on. Resistance fighters who tried to protect villages were overwhelmed by superior firepower and left dead in the fields. The campaign was not about military necessity, but about fear, and fear became the weapon Japan wielded most ruthlessly. Estimates of the death toll from the Zhejiang campaign reach as high as 250,000 Chinese civilians. This staggering number reflected not only killings, but also the famine, disease, and displacement caused by scorched earth tactics. Survivors recalled endless columns of refugees fleeing burning villages, carrying bundles of possessions on their backs. Roads were choked with families wandering aimlessly, their homes erased, their futures uncertain. Entire counties were depopulated, their fields abandoned, their towns hollow shells of ash and rubble. Disease spread rapidly in the wake of destruction, as untreated wounds contaminated water, and starvation claimed countless lives. For those left behind, survival was not simply difficult, it was almost impossible. The airmen had left China, but their presence had triggered devastation on a scale far beyond their mission. The Japanese sought to break the will of the Chinese people through terror, but instead they deepened hatred and strengthened resistance. The raid's symbolic victory for America became a catastrophe for China, and its human cost was measured in the hundreds of thousands. The brutality was compounded by the deliberate use of biological warfare in the region. Japanese forces, particularly Unit 731, introduced cholera, plague, and typhoid pathogens into rivers and wells. Entire villages were infected, and epidemics swept across provinces already weakened by famine. Civilians who had survived fire and sword now faced invisible killers in their drinking water and food supplies. Reports described wells bubbling with poisoned corpses, a grotesque strategy designed to spread sickness as far as possible. The biological assault caused outbreaks that killed tens of thousands more, leaving behind legacies of suffering that lasted for years. Survivors spoke of entire families stricken with fever, shivering, and dying within days. The cruelty was systematic, a calculated attempt to turn disease into a weapon of war. Japan's military leaders saw this as both punishment and experiment, testing the effects of pathogens on helpless populations. For the Chinese civilians, it was horror without precedent, and for history, it became one of the darkest chapters of the war. Amid the devastation, acts of defiance still flickered in the shadows. Chinese guerrillas, though outnumbered and outgunned, waged ambushes and raids against Japanese columns. Armed with old rifles, swords, and sheer determination, they struck where they could, then vanished into forests and hills. Villagers, even under threat of massacre, still smuggled food to resistance fighters, refusing to bow to terror. Underground networks continued to move stranded raiders towards safety, despite the mortal risk of discovery. In some villages, Chinese peasants misled Japanese patrols, pointing them in the wrong direction to buy survivors precious hours. Others refused to betray American airmen, even under torture, sealing their fates with silence. These small acts of courage could not stop the larger wave of destruction, but they preserved dignity in the face of atrocity. For the Japanese, the campaign may have been about control. For the Chinese, it became about survival with honor. And in that struggle, defiance took many forms, some seen, most unseen. The Japanese sought to portray the campaign as a necessary suppression of bandits and traitors, but the truth could not be hidden forever. Word of the massacres began to filter out through missionaries' underground networks, and later Allied intelligence. Reports of burned villages, mass graves, and poisoned wells horrified the world once revealed. In Chongqing, the Chinese government used the devastation as proof of Japan's barbarity, appealing to Allied nations for greater support. American leaders, upon learning of the reprisals, were struck with guilt, knowing their raid had indirectly brought such suffering. Yet they also recognized the campaign as a measure of Japan's desperation, a sign that the strike had shaken them deeply. The cruelty backfired in strategic terms, deepening international resolve to defeat Japan. Chinese hatred for the occupiers hardened further, fueling resistance movements that grew stronger in the years ahead. Japan had tried to punish and intimidate. Instead, they exposed their own brutality to the world, and that exposure would haunt them long after the war ended. For the raiders themselves, news of the reprisals reached slowly, often years after the war had ended. Some were devastated to learn that villages which had sheltered them had been wiped out in retaliation. Survivors carried guilt, feeling responsible for the thousands who had suffered on their behalf. Yet they also understood that the Chinese had acted with full knowledge of the risks, choosing to aid them out of principle and solidarity. Bonds formed in those days of crisis were not easily forgotten, and many raiders later sought to honor the memory of their rescuers. Memorials were built, stories recorded, and gestures of gratitude offered to families who had paid the ultimate price. In this way, the legacy of sacrifice was preserved across generations. The Chinese civilians who had stood by strangers became heroes in their own right. Their courage gave the Doolittle Raid its enduring moral weight, and their suffering gave it its tragic depth. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign remains one of the most overlooked atrocities of the Second World War. It was not fought on the front lines, nor did it involve great battles or famous generals. Instead, it was a war against civilians, waged with fire, sword, and disease, in response to an air raid that shook Japan's pride. The campaign revealed the cruelty of occupation and the terrible cost of symbolic victories. For China, it was a chapter of suffering layered atop years of war, famine, and resistance. For Japan, it was a stain of barbarity that undermined any claim of legitimacy in their empire. And for the Doolittle Raiders, it was a reminder that their mission had consequences far beyond bombs and fire. The raid had struck Tokyo, but the aftermath had bled China. History remembers the raid as daring, but it also remembers the reprisals as tragic. Together, they form an inseparable story of courage, sacrifice, and horror, and one that still echoes across the memory of nations. When James Harold Doolittle parachuted into the stormy night over China, he carried more than the weight of his own survival. He carried the crushing fear that the raid had been a failure. His aircraft, like all others, had not reached its intended airfield, forcing a desperate bailout into the dark. In those long hours of confusion and uncertainty, Doolittle convinced himself that the mission had fallen short of its promise. He believed the bomb damage inflicted was too slight, that too many crews had been lost, and that the risks had outweighed the gains. For a man of his precision and pride, this thought gnawed at him relentlessly as he was guided by Chinese villagers to safety. His mind replayed the sacrifices of the men who had jumped into darkness, and the uncertainty of those captured by the enemy. When he finally rejoined surviving raiders, his face betrayed confidence outwardly, but inwardly he wrestled with doubt. He even confessed privately that he expected a court-martial upon his return, believing his audacity had overreached its value. The measure of his mission in his own eyes was failure, and that belief clung to him as he prepared to return to America. Yet across the Pacific, his raid had already reshaped the war's narrative in ways he could not yet comprehend. News of the strike on Tokyo electrified the United States, a nation still reeling from the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. Newspapers blared headlines of bombs dropped on the Japanese homeland, with bold type declaring the first counterstrike had been achieved. Radio broadcasts repeated the news with triumphant tones, galvanizing public morale in cities and farms alike. For ordinary Americans, the raid was not judged by physical destruction but by psychological impact. It proved Japan was vulnerable, and it reminded Americans that their military could strike back. Roosevelt, ever the master of words, told the nation that the skies above Tokyo had felt the thunder of American power. That single statement rippled across communities, fueling resolve and unity. Politicians, journalists, and citizens alike began to speak of the raid as a turning point in national spirit. Doolittle did not yet know it, but he was being hailed as a hero, and America waited eagerly for his return. When Doolittle finally set foot back on American soil, he was astonished by the reception that greeted him. Crowds gathered at airfields, waving flags, cheering, and holding signs proclaiming him a national savior. The image of the soft-spoken aviator who had dared the impossible captured the imagination of millions. Women threw flowers, children waved streamers, and men shouted his name in gratitude. Reporters mobbed him with questions, eager to capture every detail of the daring raid. Photographs of Doolittle standing in uniform, calm and modest, splashed across front pages nationwide. To the public, he symbolized defiance, ingenuity, and courage at a moment when America needed it most. Parades and ceremonies were planned in his honor, elevating him from pilot to legend almost overnight. He accepted the acclaim with quiet humility, though inwardly he still measured success by the men who had not returned. The contradiction between his self-doubt and public adoration defined those first weeks, and the nation clung to his story as a beacon of hope. In Washington, Doolittle was summoned to the White House, where Roosevelt himself offered congratulations. The president, understanding the symbolic power of the mission, praised the audacity that had carried bombers across the Pacific. Doolittle, ever modest, downplayed his own role, insisting that the credit belonged to the crews who had flown and suffered beside him. Yet Roosevelt, with political instinct, knew the man before him had become more than a soldier. He was now an icon. The White House ceremony captured the attention of the world, with cameras recording every handshake and smile. For a nation at war, these images carried reassurance that America was striking back. Doolittle's presence beside the president represented more than military success. It represented a shift in momentum. Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest recognition of valor. The citation praised his leadership, courage, and innovation in the face of unprecedented danger. In that moment, Doolittle's doubt was overshadowed by undeniable national gratitude, and his place in history was sealed. The Medal of Honor ceremony was not merely an award, it was a performance of resilience for the American people. In the East Room, beneath glittering chandeliers, generals, congressmen, and journalists gathered to witness the occasion. Roosevelt spoke with gravity, declaring that Doolittle had carried the nation's spirit across the Pacific and proven that America would not be cowed. The general stood with composure, his voice measured, thanking his men above all else. In his heart he still felt the sting of those lost in China and the uncertainty of those captured. Yet in that room, surrounded by applause, he embodied the nation's courage. Photographers captured the moment of medal and salute, the flashbulbs freezing history into iconic images. The public devoured those images, plastering them across newspapers and magazines as symbols of determination. Every home, from factories in Detroit to farms in Iowa, saw in Doolittle the embodiment of national grit. His raid had crossed oceans, and now his presence bridged despair to hope. As celebration spread, Doolittle struggled with the personal weight of leadership. He knew the raid had cost lives and brought devastating reprisals upon innocent Chinese civilians. Reports filtering back of massacres and atrocities haunted him, though much of the public remained unaware. His humility deepened, and his speeches were filled with somber gratitude rather than triumph. He constantly reminded audiences that the mission belonged not to him but to the 80 men who had flown it. Behind closed doors he wrestled with guilt, fearing that the price of victory had been too steep. Yet the public continued to see only courage and daring, elevating him further into the pantheon of American heroes. This dissonance between perception and reality followed him for the rest of his life. But in 1942, at America's darkest moment, his modesty only added to his legend. For the nation, he was exactly the kind of leader they needed, daring yet humble, bold yet selfless. And in that paradox lay his greatness. The acclaim extended beyond medals and ceremonies, reaching into the very culture of wartime America. Songs were written, films dramatized the raid, and magazines celebrated the Tokyo Raiders as household names. Posters proclaimed their courage, urging Americans to buy war bonds and join the fight. Doolittle's face, often stern but calm, became synonymous with audacity. Yet he himself shunned celebrity, preferring the company of his men and the quiet of military duty. He accepted the honors but returned quickly to service, insisting the war was far from over. The public, however, cherished him, a figure who embodied both the daring of aviation and the resilience of the American spirit. Children learned his name in classrooms, and families spoke of him at dinner tables. His story spread far beyond America, reaching Allied nations who took heart in the daring strike. Even in occupied lands, whispers of the raid carried hope, and Doolittle, though reluctant, became a symbol of global resistance to tyranny. By the end of 1942, Doolittle had transformed from a pioneering aviator into a national icon. The man who once feared court-martial now wore the Medal of Honor, his name etched into the annals of history. His raid had given America a victory of spirit when it was most desperately needed. The paradox remained. He considered it a failure, but the world saw it as triumph. That contrast only deepened the legend, for it revealed a man driven not by ego, but by duty. His leadership had carried 16 bombers into history, and his humility had carried him into the hearts of millions. The story of his return, adorned by celebration yet shadowed by sacrifice, became a chapter as vital as the raid itself. America embraced him, not just for what he had done, but for what he represented. He was proof that boldness could rewrite the narrative of war, and that courage, even in doubt, could inspire a nation to endure. In the immediate aftermath of the Doolittle Raid, shock rippled through the halls of power in Tokyo. The Japanese High Command had assured the public and the Emperor that the home islands were untouchable, shielded by vast oceans and impregnable defenses. Now columns of smoke rising from Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama told a different story, one that shattered illusions of invulnerability. Military leaders convened in urgent sessions, their pride stung and their credibility under siege. They knew the material damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. Civilians had witnessed American bombers over their heads, proof that their government could not protect them. The press struggled to spin the raid as insignificant, yet whispers of fear spread rapidly through the population. The emperor himself was said to be unsettled, his confidence in his commanders shaken. The raid struck not at industry, but at prestige, and prestige was the currency of the Japanese Empire. What mattered most was not what had burned, but what had been exposed, and in that exposure lay a crisis of confidence within Japan's war machine. Admiral Oroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, grasped the implications more clearly than most. A master strategist who had once warned against awakening America's industrial might, Yamamoto saw the raid as proof that Japan's outer defenses were dangerously porous. If American carriers could approach close enough to launch bombers, they could strike again, perhaps in greater force. Japan's vast empire, stretching from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies, was already strained to defend its perimeters. The Doolittle Raid demonstrated that without decisive action, those perimeters would collapse under pressure. Yamamoto argued that Japan must expand its defensive buffer deeper into the Pacific, seizing islands that could serve as early warning outposts. His voice carried weight, for he was the architect of Pearl Harbor, and his prestige demanded attention. The urgency of his argument grew in the weeks following the raid, his tone sharpened by fear masked as confidence. To him, the strike was not an isolated act, but a harbinger of greater American offensives. Japan could not wait for them. It had to strike first, again. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, debates raged between the Army and Navy over how to respond. The Army demanded greater resources for the Chinese front, still absorbing the costs of punishing resistance after the raiders' escape. The Navy, however, insisted that the true threat now came from the east, across the Pacific. The Doolittle Raid had revealed America's carriers as the Empire's most dangerous enemy. Protecting the homeland and defending prestige meant neutralizing those carriers before they struck again. Thus the Navy pressed for an ambitious plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle and annihilate it. Yamamoto envisioned the perfect trap, using the island of Midway as bait, a name soon to be etched in history. The Army remained skeptical, But the fear of another raid on Tokyo tilted the balance in Yamamoto's favor. The logic was simple yet dangerous: protect Japan by extending the front farther out, and in that logic lay the seeds of Midway. The strategic shift went beyond planning a single battle. It reshaped Japan's entire defensive philosophy. Before the raid, Japan's military leaders had believed in a layered shield of bases across Micronesia, Formosa, and the Philippines. After April 1942, they realized that shield was brittle and reactive, insufficient to deter bold American thrusts. Fear drove them to seek a decisive clash, one that would destroy America's carrier force in a single stroke. Yamamoto, with characteristic boldness, proposed to extend operations deep into the Pacific, capturing Midway Atoll to serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. With Midway in Japanese hands, Tokyo would be protected from further humiliation, and the Americans would be forced to fight on unfavorable terms. The raid had shown that defense alone was not enough. Only offense could guarantee security. It was a gambler's logic, rooted in pride as much as strategy. And Yamamoto, ever the gambler, placed his bet on Midway. The die was cast in the fires of Tokyo, and the course of the war tilted with it. For the Japanese public, the consequences of the raid were hidden beneath layers of propaganda. Newspapers minimized the destruction, emphasizing that the damage was negligible and the attackers punished. Yet the visible truth was harder to conceal. Fires in Tokyo, factories damaged, civilians killed. Rumors circulated in tea houses, factories, and schools, spreading faster than official reassurances. People whispered that if bombers could come once, they could come again, perhaps in greater numbers. The raid planted seeds of doubt that no censorship could fully suppress. In cities across Japan, civil defense drills were intensified, blackouts enforced, and shelters hastily constructed. The government urged citizens to remain steadfast, but unease gnawed at the edges of society. The prestige of invincibility, so carefully cultivated, had cracked, and once cracked, it could never be fully restored. For the Japanese military establishment, the raid's humiliation demanded a demonstration of strength. Prestige in an empire built on honor could not tolerate such insult without decisive retaliation. Yamamoto promised his emperor that another Pearl Harbor would not happen, and that Japan would strike down America's carriers before they could threaten the homeland again. The Navy's preparations accelerated, with resources redirected toward assembling a massive fleet for the Midway operation. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were marshaled for the decisive clash, the largest concentration of naval power Japan had yet attempted. Confidence was outwardly projected, but within the officer corps, anxiety was real. Many knew that stretching Japan's lines farther invited risk, but fear of another humiliation silenced doubt. The Doolittle Raid had forced their hand, pushing them toward a battle they felt compelled to fight, and compulsion in war is often the first step toward catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers tracked Japan's response with growing clarity. Intercepts and code-breaking efforts at Station High-PO revealed hints of Japan's new focus on Midway. The Doolittle Raid had not only rattled Tokyo, but also accelerated Japanese moves that America could now anticipate. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and calculating, began positioning his limited forces for the confrontation he knew was coming. The raid, intended as a morale boost, had delivered a strategic windfall. It forced Japan into a gamble that America could exploit. The audacity of 16 bombers had triggered a chain reaction that would culminate in one of the most decisive battles of the war. In this way, the strike's significance extended far beyond its physical impact. It was a catalyst that reshaped Japanese priorities exposed vulnerabilities, and set the stage for Midway. Doolittle's raid had been a spark. Midway would be the firestorm that followed. The strategic consequences of the raid revealed a paradox at the heart of war. Militarily, the physical damage was minor, yet its psychological and strategic effects were enormous. It forced Japan to shift focus, to gamble on offense rather than consolidate defense. It exposed the vulnerability of the home islands, shaking both leaders and citizens. It accelerated decisions that brought about Midway, where Japan's naval supremacy would be fatally undermined. For America, the raid was a triumph of daring that bought time, morale, and strategic opportunity. For Japan, it was a humiliation that compelled reckless ambition. In that collision of pride and strategy lay the turning of the tide, and it was all set in motion by 16 bombers roaring off a carrier's deck into history. When news of the Doolittle Raid reached America, it was like a jolt of electricity surging through a nation still staggered by Pearl Harbor. Just 4 months earlier, Americans had watched their Pacific Fleet burn in Hawaii, their confidence shattered by Japan's audacity. Now headlines shouted triumph. American bombers had struck Tokyo itself, the heart of the empire. For a people accustomed to hearing only of retreat, Wake Island lost, the Philippines falling, this was something new. It was victory, however small, but symbolic enough to ignite hope across the country. Newspapers carried bold banners: Tokyo bombed, Yankee planes over Japan, revenge for Pearl Harbor. Families huddled around radios, listening to commentators recount the daring flight of Army bombers launched from a Navy carrier. The raid became more than a story of aviation. It was a story of redemption. Ordinary people, from factory workers to farmers, felt pride swell in their chests. For the first time in the war, the word victory was tied to America, and that shift in spirit was as important as any battlefield success. The media understood immediately that the raid was not just news but a weapon in the battle for morale. Columnists framed it as proof that America's ingenuity and courage could overcome setbacks. Photographs of Doolittle and his men were splashed across front pages, their calm expressions projecting confidence. Life magazine ran illustrations of bombers soaring over Tokyo, dramatizing what few had seen but all could imagine. Radio announcers spoke with urgency and triumph, their voices filled with patriotic fervor. Even Hollywood joined in, weaving the raid into newsreels shown before feature films in packed theaters. The images and words carried across the nation, from urban centers to small towns, binding Americans together in pride. Propaganda posters began to appear, urging citizens to buy war bonds with the slogan, "Remember Tokyo." The raid was transformed from a military operation into a narrative of national resilience. It gave storytellers, politicians, and soldiers alike something to rally around. And it reminded America that this war would not be fought in despair, but in determination. In factories across the country, the raid's echoes reverberated among men and women building the arsenal of democracy. Assembly lines in Detroit roared louder, workers pounding rivets into aircraft with renewed vigor. Shipyards in California bustled welders and machinists, speaking of those boys over Tokyo as inspiration for their own long shifts. War bond drives surged, Americans purchasing savings certificates not only for security, but as a contribution to vengeance. The raid story was repeated in cafeterias, union halls, and church pulpits, binding morale to production. Soldiers in training camps found their spirits lifted, no longer preparing only for defense but believing in the possibility of victory. The sense of being on the back foot began to fade, replaced by determination to take the fight across oceans. Even rationing, gasoline shortages, and sacrifices at home were endured more willingly, framed as part of the same struggle. The idea that America had struck first blood against Japan changed everything. It transformed hardship into purpose, and it infused the war effort with momentum that no setback could erase. For Roosevelt and his administration, the raid was a political gift as well as a strategic achievement. The president seized the moment, telling the nation that America's forces had proven their courage and ingenuity in the face of adversity. His words echoed across the airwaves, rallying citizens to embrace the sacrifices still to come. Behind the scenes, officials knew the raid's military effect was limited, but its propaganda value was incalculable. It allowed Roosevelt to reassure allies that America was not only defending but striking back. In London, Churchill hailed the raid as evidence that Japan was not untouchable. In Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek welcomed the strike as proof that China's suffering was not in vain. At home, Roosevelt framed the event as the beginning of a long counteroffensive. He emphasized unity, urging Democrats and Republicans alike to put aside differences for the war effort. The raid gave him political leverage, strengthening his hand in guiding the nation through wartime mobilization. And it showed Americans that their government was capable of bold action, even when odds were long. The timing of the raid magnified its effect, striking when national morale was at its lowest ebb. The Philippines were on the verge of collapse, with American and Filipino soldiers retreating into the Bataan Peninsula. Singapore had fallen to Japan, stunning the British Empire and shaking confidence in Allied strength. Rumors of Japanese submarines off the California coast fueled fears of invasion. Against this backdrop of uncertainty, the Doolittle Raid landed like thunder. It shifted the narrative from defense to offense, from despair to defiance. The sense that Japan's empire was expanding unchecked was suddenly broken. Americans could now believe that their forces, though battered, still possessed the initiative. The timing made the raid more than an isolated victory. It became a turning point in national psychology. In that moment, morale was not a luxury. It was a weapon, and the raid sharpened it to a cutting edge. Ordinary Americans embraced the raiders as symbols of courage, adopting them into the fabric of popular culture. Families spoke their names with reverence, while communities hosted parades in honor of local sons who had flown the mission. Letters poured into military offices, addressed to the men who bombed Tokyo, filled with gratitude and admiration. Children played games pretending to fly bombers over cities, their imaginations fired by stories in magazines. Veterans of earlier wars spoke with pride, saying the spirit of American fighting men had not been lost. Churches offered prayers for the safety of the raiders still missing in Asia. The nation wove their story into its own identity, a tale of audacity told at kitchen tables and factory benches alike. It was no longer about 16 bombers. It was about a nation refusing to surrender. The raiders became a mirror of what Americans wanted to believe about themselves. And in that mirror they saw resilience, daring, and hope. The propaganda machine amplified this sentiment, but it needed little embellishment. The very image of army bombers roaring off a Navy carrier was so improbable, so daring, that it captured imaginations instantly. Posters declared, "We can do it," and we did. Newspapers praised the cooperation of services, a symbol of unity in a time of rivalry. The military published selective details, enough to inspire without revealing operational secrets. Hollywood adapted the raid into dramatizations, ensuring the story reached millions more through cinema. Every medium carried the same message: America was striking back, and Japan would pay. The blending of fact and myth gave the raid a legendary aura, one that endured long after its details faded. Propaganda turned it into a story of inevitability, suggesting this was the first of many blows to come. And in that suggestion lay comfort for a nation preparing for a long, bloody war. The raid became not just history but a promise, and that promise fueled resolve across every home front. In retrospect, the Doolittle Raid was less about bombs dropped than about spirits lifted. Its physical damage to Japan was negligible, but its impact on American morale was transformative. It shifted the nation's mindset from victimhood to defiance, from reeling to striking back. Factories, farms, schools, and churches all pulsed with renewed determination, each tied to the idea that America could and would win. Roosevelt harnessed it politically, the media amplified it culturally, and the people absorbed it personally. The psychological turning point it created was incalculable, setting the tone for the long struggle ahead. The raid proved that symbolism in war could be as powerful as strategy. It was a reminder that wars are fought not only with bullets, but with belief. And in April 1942, belief was exactly what America needed most. When the Doolittle Raiders returned from China, each man carried a story etched in hardship, triumph, or grief. Some had walked through rice paddies guided by Chinese peasants, their survival owed to strangers who risked everything. Others had stumbled into captivity, their fate sealed by the iron grip of Japanese patrols. The men who escaped spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and the relief of finally reaching safety. Those who were captured endured interrogation, starvation, and the cruel uncertainty of survival. Each raider bore scars, some visible, others invisible, that would stay with them for life. For men like Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, survival was a mix of training, luck, and the kindness of strangers. For others like Jacob DeShazer, imprisonment would transform their very souls. Their stories were not uniform but bound by a common thread. They had shared the most daring mission of the early war, and that bond forged in fire would last across decades. For the captured, the ordeal was merciless. 8 raiders fell into Japanese hands, and their fate became a dark counterpoint to the mission's glory. 3 were executed by firing squad after brutal trials that mocked the very concept of justice. 1 more perished in prison from disease and neglect. The survivors endured years of captivity, held in solitary cells, fed little more than scraps, beaten when they refused to cooperate. DeShazer, once filled with rage, found solace in a smuggled Bible, his faith deepening into something unshakable. Fellow prisoner Robert Meda's death, from malnutrition, left the others with grief and guilt. Those who survived emerged gaunt, haunted, and yet proud that they had not broken. Their suffering became part of the mission's legacy, a reminder that courage often demanded a terrible price. Their release at war's end was bittersweet, freedom purchased with years of torment, and their testimony brought to light the cruelty of Japan's wartime justice. For those who returned to duty, life after the raid was equally demanding. Many of the raiders refused to rest on the laurels of fame, choosing instead to return to combat. Ted Lawson, whose memoir 30 Seconds Over Tokyo became a best-selling book, lost a leg after crash landing in China, but continued to serve as an inspiration. Others flew in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, carrying the memory of the raid into every new mission. Some, like William Farrow, had already perished, their names becoming symbols of sacrifice. Others distinguished themselves in subsequent campaigns, earning medals and commendations in far-flung theaters. They were scattered across the globe, but wherever they went they carried the aura of the men who had struck Tokyo. Their reputation gave weight to their presence, soldiers looking to them as embodiments of daring. Yet behind the medals and missions, each raider remained a man shaped by a single audacious flight, and that mission defined them long after the war was over. The brotherhood of the raiders was unlike any other. They were men from different states, backgrounds, and professions, yet the raid welded them into a single family. They called themselves not heroes, but simply the boys, united by an experience no outsider could fully grasp. At reunions after the war, they drank from silver goblets engraved with their names, each toast a reminder of survival and loss. The tradition became sacred, an annual ritual that carried their bond across decades. When a raider passed, his goblet was turned upside down, a silent testament to sacrifice. These gatherings were not about glory, but about memory, about keeping alive the stories of those who never came home. They laughed, cried, and reminisced, their camaraderie as strong in old age as it had been in 1942. Outsiders who attended were struck by the closeness of the group, a brotherhood unbroken by time. The raid had been 30 seconds over Tokyo, but it had forged a lifetime of connection. Individually, their post-war lives reflected resilience, humility, and service. Some returned to quiet civilian careers, working in factories, farms, or offices far from the spotlight. Others stayed in the military, rising to high rank, shaping the post-war Air Force into a modern institution. Jacob DeShazer returned to Japan after the war, not as a soldier, but as a missionary, preaching forgiveness in the very nation that had once imprisoned him. His transformation became one of the raid's most remarkable legacies, a testament to the power of faith and reconciliation. Richard Cole lived to be the last surviving raider, honored in his later years as a living bridge to history. Ted Lawson's book became a Hollywood film, ensuring the raid reached audiences who had not lived through the war. Some raiders never spoke much of their experiences, preferring silence to retelling trauma. Others lectured, wrote, and shared, ensuring new generations would remember. Each path was different, yet all traced back to the same April morning, and all carried the weight of 30 seconds that changed their lives forever. Their fame was both blessing and burden. While the nation revered them, many raiders resisted the idea of being called heroes. They insisted they had only done their duty, nothing more than what any soldier would have done. The weight of sacrifice, those executed, those lost in China, those civilians massacred in reprisal, tempered their pride with sorrow. Some struggled with survivor's guilt, asking why they had lived when others had not. Others embraced the spotlight as a tool to honor the fallen, telling the story not for themselves but for those who could not. Public adoration was overwhelming at times, but the raiders remained humble, grounded by shared humility. They were men of action, not words, and they let history speak louder than their own voices. Their story was both triumph and tragedy, a balance they carried quietly, and in that quiet their dignity shone all the more. Over the decades, the raiders became living symbols of courage and sacrifice, their story woven into America's cultural memory. School children learned their names, veterans groups honored their service, and presidents praised their example. Yet it was their own reunions, small and intimate, that mattered most to them. The silver goblets, polished each year, stood as both relic and reminder, each one a link in a chain forged in 1942. As the years passed, the ranks thinned, but the tradition endured. When only a handful remained, they carried on with the same spirit as when all 80 had lived. Their brotherhood was not diminished by age or death, it was eternal, bound by memory and shared sacrifice. In those gatherings they found solace, laughter, and the comfort of belonging. And when at last the goblets grew silent, the legacy remained. A brotherhood turned into legend, remembered by the nation they had inspired. In the end, the lives of the raiders after the mission reflected the full spectrum of the human experience in war. They were young men thrown into history's furnace, forever marked by what they had dared to do. Some returned to simple lives, others rose to prominence, but all remained connected to that single improbable mission. Their survival was not uniform, their stories not identical, but their bond was unbreakable. They carried the weight of loss, the pride of daring, and the humility of service. Their annual reunions kept the memory alive, passing the torch of remembrance to younger generations, and their story became not only about bombs and planes, but about courage, resilience, and friendship. The Doolittle Raid had been brief in action but infinite in impact. It shaped the war, it shaped the men, and it shaped the nation. And in the lives they led afterward, the raiders proved that 30 seconds of courage can echo for a lifetime. When the Doolittle raiders bailed out, or crash-landed in China, their survival depended on the compassion of civilians who owed them nothing yet gave them everything. Poor farmers led exhausted airmen across rice paddies, risking death to shelter strangers. Villagers shared what little food they had, offering bowls of rice or cups of tea to men who could not even speak their language. Local priests and schoolteachers guided the Americans through labyrinthine mountain paths, hiding them from Japanese patrols. Families concealed downed flyers in barns, caves, and monasteries, knowing discovery meant slaughter. Entire communities participated in this quiet resistance, choosing humanity over fear. It was an act of extraordinary courage, born not of politics but of instinctive solidarity. For the raiders, every kind face meant one more step toward survival. Yet for those who offered aid, the cost was unimaginable. Their kindness was answered not with gratitude from history, but with brutal retribution, and that retribution would stain the raid's legacy with blood. The Japanese response to the Doolittle Raid in China was swift and merciless. Furious at the Americans' escape, Japanese forces launched the Jijang-Jijangshi campaign in the summer of 1942. Soldiers swept through villages where raiders had been sheltered, unleashing a wave of collective punishment. Entire towns were burned, crops destroyed, and wells poisoned. Civilians were executed en masse, accused of aiding the enemy whether they had or not. Women suffered unspeakable atrocities, raped and mutilated as instruments of terror. Children were slaughtered alongside their parents, their innocence no shield against vengeance. The campaign claimed an estimated 250,000 civilian lives, a figure so staggering it is difficult to comprehend. What began as an act of mercy toward foreign airmen became a death sentence for entire provinces. The land that had offered refuge was turned into a graveyard of retribution, and the shadows of that tragedy would linger for generations. For survivors, memory of those massacres never faded. Elderly villagers would later recall the day Japanese troops descended, their homes reduced to ashes, their families cut down. They spoke of hiding in caves, listening to screams echo across valleys, powerless to save loved ones. They remembered the Americans too, kind young men who had stumbled into their villages, lost and hungry. The memory of helping them became intertwined with grief, a decision both noble and fatal. Survivors carried that dual legacy, the pride of defiance and the sorrow of loss. The raiders themselves, once they learned of the reprisals, were haunted by guilt. Many struggled with the knowledge that their survival had come at such a terrible cost. Yet the Chinese civilians never expressed regret in later testimonies. To them, helping the strangers had been an act of duty, rooted in values of honor and compassion, and their sacrifice became a silent testament to courage in the darkest of times. In wartime diplomacy, the Chinese sacrifice was acknowledged, but rarely given the weight it deserved. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government emphasized the raid as proof of Allied cooperation, pointing to Chinese assistance as a vital link. Yet the scale of civilian suffering was downplayed, lost amid larger campaigns and shifting political priorities. American leaders praised China's support, but rarely spoke of the massacres in public. For Roosevelt, the priority was maintaining unity in the fragile alliance, not dwelling on tragedies that might fracture morale. Still, among those who knew the truth, the numbers were staggering: 250,000 lives extinguished because of 16 bombers. In hushed tones, diplomats admitted that China had paid a price far greater than America. The suffering became part of a quiet ledger of sacrifice, invisible to most but seared into memory. It was a reminder that in war, acts of heroism often carried hidden costs, and those costs were borne by the innocent as much as by the soldiers. For the raiders, the knowledge of this sacrifice became part of their personal burden. Men like Jimmy Doolittle never forgot the price civilians had paid, often speaking of it in later years with deep sorrow. When they attended commemorations in China decades later, they were greeted not with bitterness but with honor. Elderly villagers embraced them, insisting that helping the raiders had been worth the suffering. Yet the raiders themselves carried an unspoken weight, a guilt that medals and parades could not erase. They spoke often of the bravery of Chinese civilians, crediting them with saving lives at impossible risk. Some raiders supported charities and aid programs for China after the war, small gestures of gratitude for sacrifices that could never be repaid. Their bond with those nameless rescuers became part of their brotherhood's lore. In every toast, in every story, they remembered not just the mission but those who had sheltered them, and their gratitude was eternal. The massacre of civilians also shaped Chinese memory of the war. In villages across Zhejiang and Zhejiangxi, shrines and memorials were built to honor those who died for helping strangers. Families passed down stories of sacrifice, ensuring younger generations understood the price of compassion. For China, the episode symbolized the cruelty of Japanese occupation and the resilience of ordinary people. It also highlighted the deep connection forged between Chinese civilians and American soldiers, a bond written not in treaties but in blood. During later decades, as US-China relations shifted, the memory of the Doolittle Raid remained a touchstone of solidarity. Commemorations brought American veterans and Chinese survivors together, bridging oceans of distance and history. The tragedy gave the raid a deeper meaning than mere military daring. It became a story of cross-cultural courage, of ordinary people paying extraordinary prices. And in that shared memory, Sino-American ties found a rare moment of intimacy. As historians revisited the raid, the role of Chinese civilians emerged as essential to the full story. For decades, popular accounts emphasized the bombers, the crews, and the strike on Tokyo. Only later did scholarship uncover the staggering reprisals inflicted upon those who had helped. Oral histories, diaries, and survivor testimonies revealed the human cost hidden in the shadows of glory. Historians pieced together the scale of the Zhejiangxi campaign, ensuring it would not be forgotten. The story of the raid thus expanded beyond military daring into human tragedy. It became not only an American victory, but a shared sacrifice between two nations. In the telling of that story, history gained depth, nuance, and moral weight. The legacy of the Doolittle Raid could not be told honestly without remembering the Chinese who had bled for it, and remembering them ensured their sacrifice was not lost to silence. The Doolittle Raid's place in Sino-American relations rests on this dual legacy of triumph and tragedy. It was a daring mission that restored American morale and changed the course of the Pacific War. But it was also a mission that drew down vengeance upon Chinese civilians who had chosen compassion over fear. Their courage was as vital as any pilot's skill, their suffering as defining as any bomb dropped. The memory of their sacrifice lives in memorials, in survivor testimonies, and in the gratitude of the men they saved. In that memory lies a lesson about the unseen costs of war, borne by those with no uniforms, no weapons, and no choice. For the raiders, their legacy was forever entwined with those nameless heroes in the fields of Zhejiang and Zhejiangxi. For China, the episode became a symbol of resistance and endurance under occupation. And for history, it stands as a reminder that the bravest acts are often those unrecognized in headlines. The Doolittle Raid could not have been remembered without them. After the war, the Doolittle Raid did not fade into a footnote, but evolved into a living legacy sustained by the men who had flown it. Survivors returned to civilian life, but within a few years they began to gather informally to remember comrades and retell the tight, harrowing stories only they could tell. Those informal meetings became formalized into annual reunions, occasions where 80 names and 80 lives were counted and recounted. Each reunion a ritual of memory. Veterans came from across the country, traveling at their own expense to sit in banquet halls, to argue over technical details, and to comfort the families of men who had not returned. The reunions mixed laughter and grief in equal measure, with anecdotes about short deck takeoffs sitting beside somber remembrances of colleagues executed or lost in China. Over and over the men insisted they had done no more than their duty, yet their audiences saw heroes and hung on each sentence. As the years went by, the gatherings grew to include widows, descendants, and public officials who wanted to honor a defining moment of national resolve. Media coverage of these reunions ensured that the Raiders' story remained part of the wider public narrative of World War II. Museums and air shows often timed exhibits to coincide with reunions, displaying relics like flight jackets, maps, and cockpit instruments. The reunions were not pageants, but acts of communal memory, places where the past was examined with candor rather than myth-making. Each year, surviving raiders would compare notes, correct the record, and laugh at memories that only they could share. And in those rooms, the raid's human dimension, its bravery, its costs, and its complicated legacy was kept alive by the tellers themselves. The most intimate symbol of that brotherhood became the silver goblets each raider received, a ritual object that transformed into a repository of memory. Crafted as personalized cups, each goblet bore the name of its owner and the unit's insignia, passed among the men at reunions with solemnity. Tradition held that each man would drink from his goblet at the banquet, toasting comrades and the mission they had shared. When one of the raiders died, his goblet was turned upside down and retired, a quiet, dignified marker of absence that all present recognized. Over time, the collection of goblets told a story of attrition, an index of years and sacrifice measured in silver and initials. The cups themselves became relics, plated and polished, handled with affection by those who understood their meaning. Photographs of reunited raiders raising their goblets circulated widely, images that captured both joy and the weight of remembrance. For the families who inherited those goblets, the objects were tangible links to fathers and sons who had lived through extraordinary events. Museums requested the goblets for display, recognizing their power to convey a story words alone could not. Yet the men preferred to keep many goblets within the brotherhood, seeing them as private tokens of shared endurance rather than public trophies. The ritual acted as an oral history, prompting anecdotes, names, and long-forgotten details to surface in conversation. And through the simple act of drinking together, the raiders preserved a private history that helped the nation remember with nuance. Public commemoration extended beyond reunions into a network of monuments, plaques, and museum exhibits that enshrined the raiders' story. Cities and air bases erected memorials honoring the men and the mission, often with plaques listing names and short citations of valor. The Air Force and veterans organizations organized ceremonies on anniversaries, laying wreaths and reading roll calls in solemn cadence. Schools and local historical societies mounted exhibitions that contextualized the raid within the broader arc of the Pacific War. Official proclamations from governors and mayors proclaimed days of remembrance, and congressional resolutions recognized the raiders' contribution to national morale. The artifacts of the mission, maps, stripped bomb sites, and pieces of wreckage, entered collections where scholars could study them rather than allowing them to vanish. Oral history projects recorded the raiders' recollections, preserving voice and cadence that no typed transcript could capture. Archivists catalogued letters, photographs, and service records, compiling a repository for future generations to examine. These public acts of memory ensured the raid was taught in military academies as an example of inter-service innovation and courage under extreme pressure. Yet the commemorations also acknowledged the raid's complexities, including the reprisals in China and the cost borne by civilians. Museums balanced celebration with caution, including panels that discussed consequences alongside heroism. In this way, public remembrance grew more sophisticated, refusing to simplify the raid into mere jingoism. Many raiders turned to writing and testimony to make sense of what they had endured, shaping the historical narrative through memoirs and interviews. Ted Lawson's account, rendered in harrowing detail, gave readers a cockpit's eye view of short takeoffs, the strike, and the desperate flight to China. Jacob DeShaze's transformation from captured airman to missionary added moral complexity to the story, illustrating how trauma and faith can interact in unexpected ways. Richard Cole and others provided technical clarity, correcting myths about formation flying, fuel calculations, and equipment modifications. These personal narratives, combined with official reports, allowed historians to construct a fuller, more nuanced account of the raid. Survivors' testimonies addressed not only physical events but emotional landscapes, guilt, pride, mourning, and camaraderie. Lectures at universities and military colleges featured raiders recounting incidents that textbooks could not capture, giving life to the technical details. Their reflections were candid about errors and luck, resisting any easy narrative of pure triumph. Many wrote about the burden of knowing civilians had been punished in China, and they used their platforms to honor those who had helped them. Over time, the tone of memory shifted from immediate celebration to sober reflection, balancing pride with responsibility. Through memoir and speech, the raiders helped shape how future generations would understand both the daring and the cost of the mission. Their stories became primary sources for students of air power, moral choice, and the human dimensions of strategic action. As decades passed, the raiders sought out their rescuers, traveling back to China and participating in ceremonies that acknowledged shared sacrifice. These visits were often emotional reunions, with elderly villagers greeting men who had once been young and terrified strangers. Chinese officials arranged ceremonies to honor both the Americans and the local families who had sheltered them, placing wreaths and unveiling plaques in village squares. For many Chinese communities, the presence of surviving raiders validated stories of courage that had been whispered in private for generations. Translations and interpreters carried stories back and forth, bridging language and years. Governments on both sides used these moments as opportunities for diplomatic outreach, acknowledging ties forged in wartime catastrophe. Veterans spoke at schools in China, recounting how ordinary peasants saved their lives at great risk. Those testimonies helped bring the sacrifices of Chinese civilians into broader public awareness, countering earlier neglect. Memorials that once honored only military daring began to include plaques, recognizing civilian suffering as integral to the raid's history. The emotional gravity of these reunions was palpable. Tears, incense, and shared meals marked the reconciliation. In some cases, families of the dead received posthumous honors, small official recognitions that could never return what was lost. These exchanges humanized the geopolitical story, showing how individual acts of courage can bind nations in unexpected ways. Popular culture reinforced the raid's place in American memory, with films, novels, and documentaries dramatizing the peril and daring of that April mission. Hollywood adapted memoirs and accounts, turning cockpit scenes and carrier launches into cinematic set pieces that reached millions. Veterans often served as technical advisors, insisting on authenticity for the benefit of audiences and posterity. Meanwhile, historians and scholars excavated archival records, piecing together operational logs, naval orders, and intelligence intercepts that clarified contested details. Academic conferences debated the raid's strategic value, weighing symbolism against cost, and these discussions appeared in journals read by policymakers and officers. Anniversary ceremonies marked at air bases, memorials, and Capitol Hill kept the story visible to new generations, combining military ritual with public education. Schools incorporated modules about the Doolittle Raid into curricula on World War II, using it as a case study in improvisation, joint operations, and ethical complexity in war. Museums curated exhibits pairing artifacts with oral histories, allowing visitors to hear voices that once only family members had known. The result was an integrated memory, where popular myth and sober scholarship informed one another. The Raiders' narrative thus entered both the cultural imagination and the historical record, anchored by primary sources and human testimony. Even as the number of living veterans dwindled, the institutional memory ensured their story would endure. And the nation continued to debate what the raid truly meant, militarily, morally, and culturally. In their later years, surviving raiders often became bridges between generations, speaking at elementary schools, universities, and military academies about courage and consequence. Young cadets listened to men who had personally tested the limits of aviation and leadership, absorbing lessons on risk, improvisation, and responsibility. Many raiders used their visibility to lobby for veterans' causes, pushing for better care for injured airmen and support for POW survivors. Families of raiders preserved scrapbooks, letters, and flight logs, donating them to archives so that researchers could continue the work of preservation. At memorials, the names of the fallen were read aloud, their initials etched in bronze, alongside descriptions of the mission. State legislatures and Congress occasionally honored reunions with proclamations, giving official weight to private memory. The remaining raiders guarded their privacy, but accepted invitations to speak when asked, viewing public memory as part of their duty. Photographs from reunions circulated in newspapers each year, the faces growing older but no less determined in expression. Even as numbers dwindled to a few, each remaining man carried an outsized responsibility to bear witness. The last survivors often reflected publicly on the paradox of fame, gratitude for recognition, mixed with sorrow for those who paid the cost. Their testimonies, recorded on video and in print, became invaluable primary sources for historians and educators. And when the final reunions concluded, the nation still had the archives, the monuments, and the living artifacts to sustain memory. The post-war legacy of the Doolittle Raiders, therefore, is not a single story, but a layered tapestry of heroism, complexity, and remembrance. On one level, it is the tale of a bold tactical improvisation that restored national pride in a critical moment. On another, it is the story of human cost, of men captured or killed, and of civilians in China who paid with their lives for an act of compassion. The silver goblets, the reunions, and the memorials are ways of holding that complexity, refusing to let the raid become either myth or mere footnote. Veterans' memoirs and scholarly studies ensured the mission was understood in context, technically daring, strategically limited, yet symbolically vast. The brotherhood forged among the men endured as a moral compass for younger servicemen who asked what courage in wartime truly means. The raid's artifacts, preserved in museums and archives, provide tactile connections to decisions made under pressure and the human faces behind them, Generations who never lived through those spring days of 1942 can now study instruments, maps, and testimonies, and draw their own conclusions. Public memory has, over time, layered nuance onto celebration, admitting the raid's costs while honoring its bravery. That balance between admiration and regret makes the Doolittle Raid a powerful teaching story about strategy, sacrifice, and consequence. As long as scholars, museums, and families continue to tell the tale honestly, the raid will remain a vivid chapter in the history of 20th century warfare. And the goblets turned once upside down for each man who passed will still sit as silent witnesses to courage measured in action and memory. The Doolittle Raid closed April 18, 1942, not with a grand tactical victory, but with a shock that reverberated through strategy rooms and living rooms alike. On the surface, 16 medium bombers inflicted relatively modest physical damage on Japanese cities, scattering fires and disrupting production in localized pockets. Beneath those smokescreens, however, the psychological effect was immense. Japan's perceived invulnerability was punctured and American morale, after months of retreat, surged in a single headline. Political leaders in Washington seized the moment to recalibrate public narrative from vulnerability to resolve, and Roosevelt used the strike to shore up patience for the long slog ahead. Across the Pacific, Tokyo's military planners interpreted the raid as evidence of a new operational threat and began reallocating ships, aircraft, and manpower to secure an expanded defensive arc. That reallocation would ripple through subsequent campaigns, forcing Japan into decisions that stretched its logistics and invited American counterpressure elsewhere. At a human level, the raid also introduced painful trade-offs, because the very civilians who sheltered American airmen in China paid an enormous price for their compassion. The intertwined consequences, symbolic uplift for one nation and wholesale reprisal for another, made the raid an ethically complex episode from the start. Historians later argued that its strategic value lay not in tonnage destroyed, but in how it compelled Tokyo to overcommit, an overcommitment that American intelligence would exploit. That exploitation, through code-breaking and patient positioning of scarce carrier forces, converted a symbolic strike into a tangible strategic opening. In short, a small, daring operation reframed the priorities of two empires and advanced the arc of the Pacific War in ways neither planners could fully anticipate. The Doolittle Raid therefore stands as a study in how psychological effects can be as decisive as physical ones in modern conflict. Japanese naval leadership reacted with indignation and haste, seeing the raid as an affront that undermined the prestige central to Imperial command. Isoroku Yamamoto, who already worried about provoking the industrial might of the United States, argued forcefully that Japan needed to neutralize American carrier power before it could strike again. His arguments pushed the Imperial General Headquarters toward the decision to seize Midway as a forward bastion, a gamble intended to draw American carriers into a decisive battle. That gamble consumed significant Japanese resources, carriers, cruisers, escort vessels, and trained air crews that would be committed months later in one of the Pacific's largest fleet engagements. In committing to Midway, Tokyo accepted a risky overextension of lines that amplified logistical strain and reduced flexibility in subsequent operations. From Washington's point of view, the raid thus performed an unintentional strategic service by forcing Japan into a posture that American codebreakers and admirals could anticipate. Signals intelligence, having made leaps in decrypting Japanese naval traffic, interpreted Tokyo's reaction and set an ambush that culminated in the catastrophic loss of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. In that light, Doolittle's flight can be seen as a catalyst that accelerated decisions, leading to Japan's first major carrier defeat, not by direct attrition, but by altering the strategic calculus. The raid also forced Japan to thicken homeland defenses, airfields were reinforced, anti-aircraft networks expanded, and civil defense measures intensified at significant economic and manpower cost. Those defensive expenditures further diverted resources from offensive operations in the outer perimeter that Tokyo desperately needed to hold. Over time, such reassignments contributed to cumulative attrition that favored the industrially superior United States, which could replace ships and planes faster than Japan could. Thus, a single daring sortie helped create conditions that undermined Japan's long-term strategic sustainability, even as it temporarily rallied Tokyo to action. Tactically, the raid underscored the new primacy of carrier aviation and the radical flexibility of air power when combined with naval mobility. Although carriers had launched the attack only as a platform for the Army's medium bombers, the operation validated the carrier's role as a strategic springboard rather than merely a support vessel for fleet engagements. Naval planners on both sides took note. The ability to project heavy strike power suddenly depended less on static bases and more on seaborne mobility and surprise. For the U.S. Navy, the operation reinforced a doctrinal shift toward offensive carrier task forces operating independently and at range, foreshadowing later Pacific campaigns. At the same time, the raid accelerated joint planning between services, forcing the Army Air Forces, the Navy, and logistics commands to develop an unaccustomed but effective partnership under Doolittle's leadership. Those lessons about interoperability and improvisation, stripping bombers for range, training for short-deck takeoffs, and coordinating fueling at sea, would inform future amphibious and carrier-borne operations. Training, maintenance, and logistic protocols were revised in the months following the raid to institutionalize the innovations improvised in secrecy aboard the USS Hornet. Operationally, the raid exposed vulnerabilities in Picket and early warning networks, prompting both sides to invest more heavily in reconnaissance, radar, and cryptologic capabilities. For the Japanese, improving those networks proved costly and imperfect. For the Americans, exploiting weaknesses in them became a strategic priority of intelligence-driven warfare. In technical terms, the mission demonstrated the value of rapid adaptation, auxiliary fuel tanks, weight reduction, and revised bombing techniques enabled an extension of reach that doctrine had not permitted. It also highlighted human factors. Leadership, morale, and daring were as crucial as any modification, a reminder that technology alone does not determine combat outcomes. Consequently, the Doolittle Raid entered military curricula as an example of how ingenuity and inter-service cooperation can produce strategic effects disproportionate to force size. On the American home front, the raid's imagery, planes over Tokyo, sailors cheering on Hornet's deck, served as a potent antidote to the gloom of early 1942. Newspapers, radio, and newsreels transformed those images into a national narrative of resilience that fueled recruitment and support for accelerated war production. War bond drives used the raid's drama to convert patriotism into tangible resources, and factory floors echoed with renewed urgency as workers embraced the call to do more for victory. The psychological uplift among civilians translated into political capital that Roosevelt used to strengthen supply lines, expedite shipbuilding programs, and prioritize aircraft production. Allied leaders took heart as well. Churchill's telegrams celebrated the audacity, and Chiang Kai-shek's government pointed to Chinese aid as evidence of cooperative resistance. Even in occupied Europe, resistance movements drew courage from the idea that an enemy homeland could be touched, bolstering underground optimism. Cultural production, songs, films, memoirs, ensured that the raid entered the nation's mythos, giving subsequent generations a vivid story to anchor wartime memory. That mythic status carried complications, as public celebration often glossed over the human costs in China and the nuanced strategic outcomes of the operation. Historians later debated whether the symbolic victory sometimes overshadowed sober assessments of risk and consequence, but at the time symbolism itself was a crucial instrument of total war. Politically, the raid allowed policymakers to justify risky initiatives, arguing that demonstrating capability could deter or compel enemy reactions beneficial to Allied strategy. The social fabric of the United States, women in factories, men in docks, families on rationing rolls, absorbed the raid into a narrative that linked sacrifice to hope. Thus, the operation's immediate impact on morale and productivity produced downstream effects that contributed materially to the Allied war effort. James Doolittle's personal legacy is complex. Engineer, aviator, commander, and reluctant symbol of national daring. His technical expertise, instrument flying, aeronautical engineering, and a temperament honed by test flights, provided the foundation for a mission few others could have led. But equally important was his leadership style, conspicuously visible to his men, pragmatic in planning, and willing to share risk by flying the lead bomber himself. Doolittle's public humility after the raid, coupled with private anguish over the Chinese reprisals and the fate of captured crewmen, revealed a moral seriousness uncommon in wartime celebrity. Awarded the Medal of Honor and lauded as a national hero, he nonetheless continued to press for accountability, improved aerial doctrine, and better care for POWs and survivors. His subsequent career in the Army Air Forces and later the Air Force showcased his influence on bombing doctrine and the maturation of U.S. strategic air power. He advocated for training standards that emphasized instrument proficiency, navigation, and leadership under uncertainty, lessons born directly from the raid's demands. Doolittle's willingness to accept blame if the mission failed, and to share credit when it succeeded, cemented his reputation as a leader who valued collective sacrifice over personal acclaim. Even decades later, he resisted facile glorification of the raid, urging historians and the public to remember not only daring, but consequence. In military museums and textbooks, his image became shorthand for calculated audacity, daring that is disciplined by engineering and moral deliberation. For many pilots and commanders who followed, Doolittle's example provided a template for balancing innovative risk with care for the lives entrusted to command. Thus his legacy endures not only in medals and monuments, but in the professional ethos of modern American air power. The raiders themselves created a living legacy through reunion rituals, oral histories, and a moral code forged in the heat of shared danger. Their personal trajectories, some returning to civilian anonymity, others rising to high rank, and several suffering long-term wounds or imprisonment, illustrate war's uneven toll. Those who endured captivity brought back testimonies of resilience and atrocity that informed post-war treatment of POW survivors and international law debates. The group's insistence on remembering both triumph and tragedy shaped public commemoration, preventing simple mythologizing from erasing cost. As veteran spokesmen, they lobbied for memorials, caring for widows, and recognition of Chinese rescuers, ensuring the raid's memory included those who suffered in its wake. Their camaraderie, tempered by loss and survival, served as a case study in small unit cohesion, leadership, and post-traumatic adaptation. Military educators used their experiences to teach about preparation, improvisation, and conducting joint operations under severe constraints. The raiders' stories also highlighted ethical dilemmas, prompting discussions about collateral damage, civilian protection, and the moral calculus of diversionary operations. Their testimonies found their way into declassified files, oral history collections, and classroom modules that informed later generations of officers. In that archival work, researchers traced how a single mission shaped doctrine, influenced procurement choices, and altered expectations of aircrew endurance. The men's lifelong efforts to honor comrades and confess costs created a richer public understanding of what strategic daring actually demands. Consequently, the Raiders' legacy is not simply romantic legend, but a living set of lessons on leadership, sacrifice, and moral accountability. Scholars have long debated whether the raid was a strategic masterstroke, a morale stunt, or a morally ambiguous gamble with heavy human costs. Some military analysts emphasize its catalytic role in provoking Japanese overreach and thereby accelerating American operational opportunities like Midway. Others criticize the inevitable reprisals in China, arguing that symbolic strikes must weigh the potential harm to civilians who might be endangered by association. These debates have broadened into larger questions about the ethics of strategic signaling, the responsibilities of great powers toward Allied civilians, and the limits of propaganda-driven warfare. In military history courses, the raid is taught as a case study in improvisation, joint inter-service planning, and the value of risk-tolerant leadership. At the same time, ethicists and historians use the episode to probe how operational success can carry moral liabilities that reshape subsequent policy choices. The Doolittle Raid thus occupies a contested space where operational ingenuity and human cost intersect in sharp relief. Recent scholarship has reassessed the Chinese experience more fully, drawing on oral histories and newly available archives to give voice to civilian victims. This fuller historiography complicates celebratory narratives, insisting that memory must encompass both valor and consequence in equal measure. It also informs contemporary doctrine on proportionality and civilian protection, reminding planners that symbolic operations can trigger real human suffering. The debate remains lively because the raid offers no easy moral closure. It provides instead a sustained invitation to weigh ends against means in wartime, and that unresolved tension is part of why the Doolittle Raid continues to command scholarly attention and public reflection alike. In the sweep of World War II, the raid's material impact was modest, yet its ripples changed perceptions, decisions, and destinies across the Pacific. It demonstrated how a small, well-executed innovation, basing aircraft on a carrier for an unexpected purpose, could produce effects disproportionate to force size. It also taught hard lessons about the moral consequences of warfare, in which civilians inevitably become entwined with military objectives. Doolittle and his men became enduring symbols because they embodied both the daring of aviation pioneers and the burdens of command responsibility. Their story survives because it contains the drama of invention, the intimacy of brotherhood, and the ache of collateral suffering. Museums, monuments, and memories keep that story alive, not as a single moral tale, but as a complex human saga demanding reflection. For commanders and students of strategy, the raid remains a lesson in seizing psychological initiative while remaining mindful of unintended consequences. For families and communities, it is a story of bravery and loss, of strangers who risked life to help one another and paid the cost. And for historians, it is a reminder that small acts can catalyze large shifts, for better and for worse, in the sweep of global conflict. When we remember the Doolittle Raid, we recall planes lifting from a carrier into uncertain skies, men who bet everything, and a world that shifted under their wings. That image, 30 seconds over Tokyo, has the power to inspire, instruct, and trouble us in equal measure, because courage rarely arrives unaccompanied by consequence. In the end, the raid's true legacy is its stubborn refusal to be simple. It is a story of daring, tragedy, innovation, and ethical ambiguity that will remain essential to the history of modern war.